In the quiet heart of the Vatican lies a mystery that time has never erased, the lost story of a fallen heavenly being, hidden not in legends, but in complete silence. Dusty old documents whisper about a creature not exiled, but bound, living where no ray of light dares to enter. The Church has never spoken its name, only protected its existence in the shadows. If you like uncovering mysteries like this one, remember to subscribe. Now, gently close your eyes and step into the silent hallways of history. Beneath the Vatican pavement, beyond the splendour of the torchlit chapel floors and the echo of ancient prayers, there's a silence that's more than just the absence of noise. No, the stillness of that place is something else, something that listens. Visitors walk through St. Peter's Basilica every day, gazing at the majestic dome, marvelling at the gold, and taking photos of the marble saints standing guard. But they don't notice what stirs beneath their feet. And if they did, they'd never speak of it. Because in the Vatican basements, past the crypts and beneath the archives, lies a place few know about, and even fewer are allowed to see. The whispers began centuries ago, not from books or sermons, but from those who spent their lives in the Church's shadow. Custodians, sentinels, archivists. People who noticed details others were taught to ignore, a door that shouldn't be there, a passage not on any map, a room colder than the surrounding rock, even without a draught. One of these whispers came from an old guard named Lorenzo. He served silently for over 40 years, looking after the Vatican's darkest corners. He was a man of routine. Every night, he'd light the same hallway with a brass oil lamp and make sure all the archive doors were securely locked. He never expected anything out of the ordinary, until one night. That night, the air felt different, heavy. His lamp flickered as he walked down a hallway he'd patrolled countless times. But this time, the door at the end was ajar, a door he'd never seen open before. There was no sound, just a feeling, as if someone was watching him, not from around the corner, but from deep within. Lorenzo moved closer. Inside, the room was narrow, bare, except for a stone staircase spiralling down into darkness. No signs, no rope, no obstacles, just steps, with icy air rising from the opening like a breath. He said he didn't go down. He said he didn't have the courage. But later that night, in the quiet of his home, he could still hear it. A low sound, not quite a voice, not quite wind. He left his post the next morning and never returned. Years later, his story was found in a letter he wrote, but never delivered. It was hidden behind a loose brick in the wall near his old home. In the letter, he spoke of a creature beneath the Vatican, not buried, not forgotten, but locked away, imprisoned. The Vatican never mentioned Lorenzo. There's no trace of him in personnel records. But his set of keys, still shiny and heavy brass, was discovered years later in front of the sealed door he claimed to have seen open. And this is where the nighttime story begins, not in the light, but in the shadow, not in scriptures, but in the silence, in a whisper beneath the basilica that once heard is never truly forgotten. The Vatican is full of stories, but some are never written down. They're passed on in hushed tones, by word of mouth, unseen by anyone. And one story, more than any other, seems to disappear the moment it's told, not because it's made up, but because it's too close to something no one is allowed to name. This is a story no one will confirm. Inside the Apostolic Palace, behind locked doors and velvet-lined hallways, there's a document not found in any official record. No archivist will discuss it, no cardinal will admit it. And yet, every few decades, it reappears, not as a document, but in a terrified glance, in a missing page, or in the sudden silence of someone who used to talk too much. It always starts the same way, a reference to a chamber, older than the basilica above, deeper than the crypts, and in that chamber, not a relic or a text, but a presence, something bound, something not dead, but not truly alive either, a being. They call it fallen, though no one dares to say from where. In the early 1930s, a young Jesuit priest named Father Calderon arrived in Rome. He was brilliant, quiet, and devoted. His initial work gave him rare access to the innermost sections of the Vatican archives, not the public rooms, but the sealed basements. He spent long nights beneath the basilica, reading documents by candlelight, translating lost languages, and making notes in small, leather-bound journals. But one night he stopped taking notes. According to his last journal entry, dated October 1935, he had found something unusual, a reference to a scroll, long believed destroyed, that spoke of a war not between men, but between angels. The scroll described it being cast down, but not with violence. It had chosen to fall and had asked to be imprisoned, not destroyed. Its motivation was not remorse, but something colder, a plan. A few days after that entry, Father Calderon disappeared. The church declared he had returned to Spain, but there are no travel records. His room remained untouched for years. His journals, once filled with splendid Latin texts, ended mid-sentence. His candle had burned down to its base. Years later, a Vatican librarian discovered a small piece of paper behind one of the shelves Father Calderon frequently visited. It was unsigned. It contained only one line. "It is not what we have been told. It is not bound by chains. It is bound by a decision." No official has ever commented on this case. However, in the quietest corners of Rome, older priests are still heard whispering his name, as if it floats just beneath the stone. Not all night stories aim to bring peace. Some exist only to remind us that even in places built on faith and light, there are shadows that will never be confirmed, only remembered. Behind the imposing marble columns of the Vatican, hidden in its deepest foundations, there is an unnamed door. It stands at the end of a narrow passage beneath the Apostolic Palace. Most who work in the palace don't even know it exists, and those who do never discuss it. There are no keys for this door, no handle, no trace in any architectural design. And yet, it is always guarded. Day and night, 2 members of the Swiss Guard stand watch nearby, though they are never seen directly in front of it. Their orders are simple: allow no one to approach, ask no questions, discuss nothing behind it. But it wasn't always this way. The story goes back to 1928, when renovations on the palace's ground floor led to the discovery of a strange hallway. It was narrow and uneven, made of ancient stone not used in modern Roman buildings. Workers reported feeling dizzy at the end of the hallway. One of them suddenly fainted and couldn't remember what he had seen. There's an old photograph, black and white, grainy with time. It shows a tall, arched door of black iron, sealed and welded shut at the edges. The Vatican has never officially admitted it, but in the bottom corner of the photo someone has written 2 Latin words: Custos vigilat, the guardian watches. In 1954, Cardinal Bellini, a respected figure known for his devotion to church history, requested permission to examine the sealed chamber. His request was denied. A few days later, he was transferred to a monastery in northern France. He never returned to the Vatican. Years later, another clergyman revealed that Bellini believed the chamber was not empty. He claimed it was not a crypt or a passage, but a prison with a single occupant. Who or what would need to be kept hidden in the most secure part of the Vatican? This question has never been answered, but a former archivist once hinted at something during a rare interview before his death. He said the Vatican holds many relics, many lost texts, but this was different. "It's not history we're protecting," he said. "It's everything that came before." Within the archives there's a single parchment sheet filed under the wrong code. It seems to be part of an early 18th century confession. The author claims to have participated in a ritual meant to reinforce the sacred door beneath the throne. He wrote that the being behind the door has no eyes, yet it watches, no mouth, yet it communicates. And it has no chains, because it doesn't try to leave. The Vatican has never responded to inquiries about the door or the guards who still watch over it. But late at night, deep within the Vatican, some say a faint sound can be heard, like a held breath in a slow, endless silence. And so the mystery deepens. In the heart of the world's most guarded city, behind a door, no one opens. Something waits, something that has always watched. For much of history, the name Lucifer has been spoken with terror. He is known as the enemy of light, the one cast out of paradise, the one who brings pride and decay. But what if the story we know is only part of something larger? And what if the earliest versions of this story held a meaning the modern church has quietly rejected? The Vatican teaches that Lucifer fell because of rebellion. He chose pride over service and was cast out of paradise like a lightning bolt. But hidden deep within, etched, forgotten, are other versions, older, stranger, that paint a different picture. These texts, many of which have been removed from public scripture, suggest that Lucifer did not fall by force, but resigned willingly. The Book of Enoch, once respected by early Christian communities, describes not a single fall, but many. It speaks of angels who left their place in heaven not out of rebellion, but out of compassion. They saw humanity's suffering and chose to descend, breaking heaven's laws, to bring knowledge and light to earth. One of these beings, it reads, was the brightest among them. For centuries, this idea has been quietly set aside. The Vatican has never fully recognized the Book of Enoch as official scripture, though some fragments have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some scholars believe this was no accident, because buried in those chapters lies a dangerous hypothesis: that Lucifer was not just a rebel, but also a guardian, someone who sought to give humanity something it was not meant to have. In the early 16th century, a young monk named Silvano de Alba was discovered copying ancient texts in the Vatican's lower library. His work was precise, attentive, and deeply curious. One night, with trembling hands, he brought a parchment to his superior. It was a faded parchment, speaking of a council of angels. Among them was one called the Morning Star. He argued that humans were too blind, too lost. He wanted them to see as angels saw. He asked for the veil to be lifted. The others refused, and he left. Silvano was never seen again. His work was removed from the shelves. Years later, his notes were discovered hidden in the spine of an old hymn book. In clumsy Latin, he had written, "Perhaps he did not fall. Perhaps he was sent to bring light where light did not reach." The Vatican has never answered questions about Silvano or the parchment, but the rumours continue. Among some priests and historians, there is quiet talk of a truth too complex for doctrine, a truth that challenges the very narrative of good and evil. In this nighttime story, we are not chasing demons in the dark. We are chasing the light that has been buried with them, a light the Vatican once feared would shine too brightly if it ever came out. Hidden beneath the great basilicas of the Vatican, there is a room most people will never see. It has no windows, no signs, no visitors. What it does have are shelves, endless rows. Each one holds a secret the Church has chosen not to share. This is the crypt where forbidden texts rest. Not all books are forbidden because they are false. Some are hidden because they are too difficult to explain. Others because they question the stories the world has been forced to believe. Over the centuries, the Vatican has quietly collected thousands of these works. Some have been banned, others lost to time and then recovered, but all have been sealed for reasons few will ever understand. Among these texts is a book called The Grand Grimoire. It is said to be one of the oldest surviving manuals on evoking, binding, and commanding spiritual entities. According to legend, it contains rituals dating back to the time of King Solomon, the biblical ruler believed to have controlled entire legions of spirits. Many believe the grimoire is a myth, and yet it is rumoured that the Vatican keeps an original copy in its archives, locked behind 3 iron doors. Another text, less known but equally unique, is the Gospel of Judas. In this version of the crucifixion story, Judas is not a traitor. He is the one Jesus chose to carry out the plan. The Church rejected the text long ago, but fragments of it are still preserved in the Vatican archive, far from public view. Then there is the mysterious Liber Salomonis, or Book of Solomon, a dark volume related to ancient celestial beings. It describes creatures not from paradise, but not entirely from hell either, beings who once walked among men, offering knowledge in exchange for silence. Some passages describe symbols so ancient they don't correspond to any known language. Some pages are said to be impossible to read except by moonlight. In 1943, a scholar named Pietro Cavani was given temporary access to a restricted wing of the Vatican Library. He was tasked with studying ancient texts that hadn't been opened in generations. But after only 3 days of work, he suffered what doctors called a sudden collapse. He was removed from the Vatican and never returned. Before losing consciousness, he is said to have whispered a phrase to his assistant: "The seals are still warm." The Vatican had no comment. The room where he worked was locked and never reopened, and the books he touched were moved to a deeper storage. Some claim that the forbidden texts don't just hold forgotten history, they hold instructions, warnings, descriptions of rituals meant to control the unseen. And at the centre of these documents is a recurring figure, a being unnamed but described again and again with the same phrase, "the one who fell but did not forget." In this night tale, secrets aren't hidden in dark corners, they're on the page, waiting to be read, waiting to be remembered. The man's name was Matteo Rossi, and for nearly 5 decades he was the Vatican's unseen hand. He wasn't a priest, he wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a guard, he was a janitor. He swept the floors, he tended the candles, he dusted the wooden beams, he walked the marble halls when no one else was awake. His work was quiet, thankless, and constant, but it gave him something few others had: access. Matteo started his work in 1949. The world was still reeling from the war. The Vatican had become more cautious, even more secretive. New sections were closed off to outsiders, lower passages reclassified, and it was during one of his nightly rounds that Matteo discovered the passage that would change the course of his life. He didn't mean to discover it. The passage was behind a cabinet that had recently been cleared out. It wasn't on his map. The walls were older, darker. The light from his oil lamp seemed to dim as he went deeper. There was no sound except for the faint scuff of his shoes on the stone. And at the end of the passage, he discovered a portal. Not a wooden portal like the others in the palace. This one was dark metal, cold to the touch. It had no lock, no knob, just a faint etching at eye level. He traced it with his fingers and felt the symbol of a winged figure, inverted. He had never seen anything like it. When he brought it up to his supervisor the next morning, the man turned pale, told Matteo to never speak of it again, but he did speak of it once, many years later. In a letter he never sent, the letter was discovered after Matteo's death. In 2001, it was hidden in an old prayer book in his modest apartment just outside the Vatican walls. The ink had faded in places, but most of the words were still clear. In it, Matteo described returning to that passage several times over the years. He felt drawn to it, not out of curiosity, but by something he called the presence. He never tried to open the portal, but he said that at times he could hear a sound behind it, a breathing, slow, steady, and inhuman. One night in the early 70s, he left a candle outside the portal just to see. When he returned the next morning, the candle was gone. In its place was a single black feather, smooth and unbroken. Matteo never told anyone. He kept the feather until his death, sealed in a small wooden box beneath his bed. No one knew what kind of bird it came from. No one could even be sure it was a bird. The Vatican made no statement about the discovery. But the passage Matteo described was later found on ancient blueprints from the 18th century, a passage that led nowhere, that ended in stone. And yet, for 50 years, a quiet man swept its floors, lit its candles, and listened to something that shouldn't have been breathing, in a place not marked on any map, behind a portal that wasn't meant to be discovered. There is a room beneath the Vatican that is not mentioned in any tour guide, in any book, and is not spoken of by name. Those who know of it simply call it the Chamber of Silence. Not because it is silent, many places in the Vatican are silent, but because the silence in that room is different. It is heavy, almost alive. In the early 1960s, a team of Vatican stonemasons was sent to reinforce a portion of the Apostolic Palace after a small earthquake shook its foundations. The damage was minor, a few cracks, a few shifted stones, nothing unusual, until they discovered a section of wall that sounded hollow. When they tapped it, the echo came back too quickly, as if there was something behind it, a hidden space. The team got special permission to open the wall. What they uncovered was a passage, steep, narrow, and lined with black stone instead of the usual Roman brick. The floor was made of large square slabs, and the air smelled old, of paper and ash. At the end of the passage was a single portal, sealed with iron bars and bearing an ancient mark that no one could identify. But when they broke it down, they discovered the chamber. It wasn't large. Bare stone walls, a vaulted ceiling, and a large circle carved into the floor. At its centre stood a stone pedestal. There was nothing on it. No books, no artifacts, no writings. But the moment they entered, the temperature dropped. One of the workmen swore he saw frost forming near the corners of the room, despite it being the middle of summer. The foreman reported the discovery, expecting praise. Instead, the chamber was sealed again within hours. Vatican guards arrived before the team had even packed up their things. No one was thanked, no one was compensated. The men were told to forget what they had seen. One of them, a man named Giulio Ferrara, tried to speak out a few months later. He was dismissed and disappeared from public life. His family would later claim that he had started to fear the dark, not just at night, but in dark rooms during the day. Years later, a retired Vatican historian who had worked in the archives mentioned the room in a personal journal. He called it a room without memory. He wrote that the stones used to build it didn't match the surrounding architecture, that they were far older than any other hidden element in the bowels of the Vatican. He ended the note with one last thought. There are spaces where the Church preserves knowledge, and there are spaces where it preserves warnings. The Chamber of Silence remains inaccessible to this day. Its presence is not denied, for it is never named. And yet, in the quiet moments before dawn mass, some sentinels claim to feel a pulsation through the floor, a murmur, faint and low, rising from somewhere beyond the rock, as if something locked away in that space is still watchful and still patient. Among the long passages of the Vatican, few orders possess a more discreet authority than the Jesuits. They are scholars, confessors, and guardians of knowledge. They are also those to whom secrets too fragile to be revealed to the masses are entrusted. And yet sometimes, even among the most rigorous souls, curiosity turns into danger. In 1971, a Jesuit religious named Father Antonio de Luca was granted exceptional access to the inner areas of the Vatican Library. He had dedicated decades to the study of theology and archaic languages. Known for his discretion and accuracy, he embodied the type of figure the Church could trust. He requested access to a particular sequence of volumes, kept in the basements, identified only by coded ciphers. His request seemed unusual, but not disturbing, at least not at first. In the following weeks, Father De Luca visited the archive every day. He worked late into the night. He always remained isolated. However, those who passed through the reading room noticed something was changing. He began to look pale, exhausted, distant. He no longer greeted others. He stopped joining morning prayer. One afternoon, just before the bells of St. Peter's called for Compline, a young seminarian found him sitting in the archive, motionless. His candle had long since burned out. In his lap, he clutched a parchment. On that surface was a drawing, a winged creature trapped by circles of symbols. Its face was turned upwards, its eyes were sunken. When asked what he had observed, Father De Luca uttered a single word: eyes. He was moved to the Vatican infirmary. Doctors found no physical abnormalities, but he stopped communicating completely. He refused food, broke his rosary piece by piece, and scattered the beads across the floor. After a week, he disappeared from his room without a trace. The window had not been touched. The door had not been opened. The Vatican made no public statement. Within weeks, his name was erased from the list of serving priests. His office was cleared, his research papers were burned, but one item survived. A single sheet from his diary, hidden behind a shelf, was later discovered by a new archivist. The page was short, with writing that swayed between the lines. It read, "There is a gap beyond the archives, not built by men. It watches and waits." Today, Father De Luca is only whispered about in passing. Among the older Jesuits, his name is sometimes followed by silence, as if to evoke something that cannot be openly spoken. And deep within the Vatican archives, where the oldest volumes still rest behind sealed display cases, there is an empty shelf, no writings, no dust, just emptiness where something once existed. In this night tale, we encounter not only the mysteries of the rock and the scriptures, but also souls who dared to look too closely. Some passages in the Vatican lead to history, others, once crossed, never close. In the autumn of 1682, long before electric light reached the stone passages of the Vatican, a letter was drafted that would never be found. It was sealed with wax without any signature and buried deep within a set of scrolls that had remained untouched for centuries. It was discovered only in 1980 during a routine review of the oldest manuscripts kept in the Vatican archive. The librarian who found it did not identify the handwriting, but the language was sharp and formal, written in Latin by someone who mastered both the Holy Scriptures and the secret. The scroll was initially a report of ordinary matters, an inventory of objects kept in the inner crypt, versions of ancient psalms. But halfway through the parchment, the tone changed. It became intimate, urgent, and then it described something unusual. The writer spoke of a rupture, not in the rock, but in the spirit, a laceration in the celestial order. He called it fractura lucis, the wound in the light. He did not clarify how he had learned of it, only that it was hidden beneath the Vatican. A being, he claimed, not generated by sin, but separated from the choir of angels. One who had preferred silence to revolt, and this being, he said, had been placed under seal, not to be punished, but to prevent it from returning. The scroll described the presence as not rushed, but withdrawn. Not exiled, but contained, as if at one time there had been 12 voices in the celestial choir, and now only 11 remained. The absent one had been chained not with shackles, but in stillness, imprisoned underground by the very ones who had once sung beside it. For years this scroll remained hidden, but a single annotation was added to the margin by the archivist who translated it in 1980. The annotation read, "Connected to the sealed chamber beneath the basilica, it could be the origin of the containment ritual." That chamber, as many know, has no name, no official entrance. It is marked only by silence and continuously guarded. And now, thanks to this rediscovered letter, it seemed that the chamber was not simply a legendary place, but the prison of a being too dangerous to be released and too sacred to be annihilated. The Vatican made no public reference to the scroll. It was quietly returned to storage, this time with a new classification, known only to 2 officials still alive. But before the letter was sealed again, the last line was transcribed. It read, "We could not return it to paradise, because paradise no longer remembered its name. And so we find ourselves with another page of a night tale that does not seek to reassure but to disturb. Not all secrets are loud. Some are written in a whisper and buried under centuries of dust. And under that dust, something archaic watches the world on the surface and waits for the light to shine again. Beneath the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica lies a hidden city of the dead. Few visitors realize they walk above it, and even fewer are authorized to access it. But the Vatican necropolis, older than the basilica itself, holds much more than bones and tombs. It holds layers of faith, terror, and something even deeper, something the Church has never fully clarified. This underground labyrinth was first brought to light in 1940. During construction work for Pope Pius XV's tomb, workers broke through a wall and found a series of chambers dug into the earth, lined with ancient bricks and filled with tombs. It was a Roman burial site, preserved by centuries of silence. The discovery was momentous, but the Vatican quickly took control of the excavations, and access was strictly restricted. Some tombs dated back to the 1st centuries after Christ, pagan symbols intertwined with Christian ones, names consumed by time, mosaics depicting forgotten deities alongside images of crosses and fish. It was clear that this was a place of transition, where the ancient world met the new. But one section of the necropolis clearly stood out. A narrow passage, lower than the others, led to a closed door. The stone beyond it was darker, the air colder. The priests overseeing the work assigned it a number, Vault 12, but for those who entered it was simply known as the quarry. An archaeologist, a young man named Roberto Mancini, was allowed to document the findings. In his private notes he described the strange feeling that came over him every time he entered Crypt 12. He described a sound, like wind in a cave, even though there was no air movement. He noted that the lanterns burned more dimly, and once a flame went out completely without warning. At the centre of the crypt stood a bare stone platform, not a tomb. Not an altar, just space, as if something had once been there, but had been removed or had left. In 1941, after only 6 months of study, the Vatican closed the vault. No reason was given. Mancini was reassigned. Years later, in a private letter, he wrote, "There's something down there the Church doesn't want disturbed. It's not a mystery of history. It's a mystery of presence." The Vatican necropolis remains one of the most heavily guarded archaeological sites in the world. Guided tours are now allowed in some areas, carefully selected and closely monitored. But Crypt 12 is not among them. It's no longer on official maps. And so, beneath the basilica that crowns Catholicism, beneath the gold and the grandeur, lies a silence older than prayer. In this evening's tale, the graveyard is not the conclusion, but the beginning, and among the ruins of forgotten gods and sacred bones, something waits in the dark earth, something that has been buried, not because it's dead, but because it refused to leave. There's a place beneath the Vatican where even the air seems afraid to move. It's not mentioned in any tourist guide. There are no guided tours in its corridors, and no one agrees on who found it first. Among those who still discuss it, they call it the Hollow Church. It was discovered by chance in the late 50s during a survey of the lower catacombs. The Vatican had sent a small team to inspect damage from humidity near one of the oldest mausoleums. Part of the wall had started to crack, and it was feared it might give way. When the workers removed the stones, they expected to find more earth, perhaps an old drainage channel. Instead, they found a hidden chamber. It opened into a wide, vaulted, large circular space with blackened walls. On the opposite side stood what looked like an altar, but it had no markings, no symbols, no crosses. The floor around it was covered in twisted, melted iron fragments, fused to the stone. Whatever had once been there had been annihilated by a heat so intense it left burn marks on the ceiling. One of the workers, a man named Luca Bellari, later described the room as the coldest and hottest place he had ever felt. His skin tingled as if it were burning, and yet the air was freezing. He said the silence inside was not ordinary. It pressed against his ears like deep water, as if sound itself feared to echo there. The team reported the discovery to their supervisors. Within 24 hours, every worker was reassigned. The entrance was bricked up and sealed. Bellari never entered the Vatican again. Years later, in a quiet moment, he would tell his son that something in that room had not been annihilated, it had only hidden. Official documents about the Hollow Church are virtually non-existent. No photographs, no public statements, but an internal memo mistakenly filed with building plans in 1972 referenced the burned chapel below level 3 and advised against further inspection in that section. The document was unsigned, and the signature line had been blacked out with ink. Some believe the room once housed a ritual space, something older than Christian Rome. Others argue it was the site of a failed containment, an attempt to seal something that could not be sealed. A Jesuit priest who left the order shortly after the chamber's discovery wrote in his private diary, "It was never meant to celebrate Mass. It was meant to hold something else, and perhaps it still is." In this part of our evening's tale, the stone does not remember Scripture. It remembers fire. A fire that did not burn upwards, but inwards. A fire that left no ash, only terror. And even now, buried beneath centuries of history and holiness, the hollow church waits, empty and silent, but never truly still. Far below the marble floors of the Vatican, deeper even than the necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica, there exists a passage few have ever entered. It lies behind a locked iron gate, marked only by a faded number etched into the stone. 34. No sign, no inscription, just a number and silence. The priests call it Catacomb 34, but no one speaks that name aloud anymore. The first mention dates back to a report drafted in 1953. A small team of Vatican archaeologists had been sent to map the deeper burial corridors beneath the basilica. Their records show they had catalogued over 200 crypts and chambers. Most were ordinary, rows of tombs, faded inscriptions, crumbling sarcophagi, but then they found something different. A narrow corridor much more ancient than the others. At the end they reached a sealed door, carved with symbols none of them could identify. They marked it as Catacomb 34, left a temporary lamp burning, and promised to return the next day. They never did. The next morning, the entrance was found bricked up and sealed. No instructions had been given, no workers were expected. But when the team returned, the entrance was already sealed. A Vatican official met them at the entrance and informed them that the inspection was over. Their services were no longer needed. One of the archaeologists, a woman named Sister Elena di Arco, later wrote in a private diary that something had happened during that last hour inside the catacomb. The lamp they had left there had gone out, even though the oil was still full. The air had changed. She said she felt like she was walking underwater, heavy and oppressive on her chest. She claimed to have heard a sound, faint and constant, like a breath through the stone. Her diary was never published. It was found among her belongings after her death in 1987. Among the pages was a crude drawing. It depicted a curved wall covered in small, repeated symbols, none from any known language. In the centre was a circle with a single vertical slot, like an eye closed in sleep. For decades, Catacomb 34 remained off all official maps. Even the archivists who managed the lower levels had no record of it. But in 2011, a construction team working on new climate control systems accidentally discovered a side wall made of a different type of stone, cold to the touch, smooth as glass. They reported it and were ordered to leave the area immediately. That section of the archives was sealed the next morning. No explanation was given. In this evening's tale, we don't follow the light. We follow the spaces where the light refuses to penetrate. Catacomb. 34 may have no name, no voice, no memory, but something behind its sealed wall still waits, not dead, not dreaming, but listening. And as long as that number is etched into the stone, the silence of the Vatican will not mean peace, it will mean warning. Long before Rome became the centre of the Catholic world, it was a city built on older stones, older names, and older fears. Beneath those layers of empire and faith lies something stranger than myth, signs etched into walls where no language exists. In the early 90s, a silent excavation took place beneath the southern edge of the Vatican complex. The official reason was a study of ventilation beneath the basilica. But the workers, a small team of Vatican-authorized archaeologists, quickly discovered something else behind a crumbling brick wall, buried under 2 meters of earth and rubble. They discovered a series of steps leading to a narrow chamber. At first it seemed just another forgotten space, but then they saw the symbols. The walls were covered in incisions, not painted, but etched deeply into the stone, as if they had been pressed by something hotter than a chisel. Some of the incisions were curved, others jagged, like claws scraping the marble. They formed no sentences. No one could decipher them. They were not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not even Sumerian or Egyptian. The shapes did not correspond to any known archaic system. Father Paolo Visari, a scholar of early Christian texts, was called to examine the room. He had spent much of his life deciphering lost languages. When he entered the room, he didn't speak for almost 10 minutes. When he did, his voice was low. He said, "These are not letters, they are commands." His full account was never published, but parts of it survived in handwritten notes found years later. He believed the symbols were not meant to be read, but to be touched. He described the chamber as a place of wait, where time seemed to slow down and the mind refused to focus. He claimed that one of the incisions pulsed faintly when he approached, not like a sound, but like a heartbeat behind the wall. Within a week, the chamber was sealed, not with bricks, but with reinforced stones. 2 guards were stationed near the site, although no one ever explained why. Father Visari was transferred to a monastery in southern Italy, where he lived in silence until his death in 2004. But the strangest thing came years later. In 2008, a Vatican linguist examining photographs of the chamber noticed something unsettling. One of the symbols found beneath the basilica matched a small incision discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a symbol that had never been translated, not even by scholars of ancient Hebrew. The 2 signs were identical, etched thousands of miles apart, and perhaps thousands of years apart. And so the mystery deepens. These symbols were not Roman, they were not part of any language recognized by the Church. They seem older than the stones that guard them, and whatever message they contain, the Vatican no longer tries to translate. In this part of our evening's tale, words do not bring relief, they bring questions. Carved in silence, hidden in stone, the message waits, not understanding, but obedience. In the remotest corners of the Vatican archives, where the air smells of old parchment and the light is always dim and golden, lies a sealed drawer, known only to a few, not appearing in any catalogue. Its label is long faded, but inside that drawer, wrapped in a cloth darkened by time, there exists a burned, almost ruined parchment. Many consider it useless, but others call it a map. It was discovered in 1957 during a silent reorganization of the old repositories. A young archivist named Tommaso Bellini was tasked with emptying drawers that hadn't been opened since the 19th century. Most were filled with documents no one had touched for generations, but one drawer wouldn't open completely. Stuck behind a pile of decaying parchments was a flat bundle, scorched at the edges, fragile to the touch, smelling of smoke, though there had been no fire. Tommaso carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, faded to the colour of bone. Strange lines ran across it, curling and winding like rivers in an ancient landscape. There were no names, no scale, no language, only shapes drawn by a hand both careful and chaotic. In the lower right corner was a mark, an emblem that had been partially burned, but what remained was unmistakable. It was an angel's wing, drawn not as it soared upwards, but as it plunged, with the feathers curling downwards like smoke. At first, Tommaso thought it was a symbol, a forgotten work of art or a failed map. But as he traced the paths on the page, he noticed something else. The lines did not follow any surface geography, but corresponded to another pattern, the layout of the catacombs beneath the Vatican. One path curved exactly like the Eastern Passage beneath St. Peter's Basilica, another turned around the foundations of the Apostolic Palace, and another, barely visible beneath the layer of soot, ended at a point with no known chamber, just an empty space beneath the Vatican Hill. Tommaso reported his discovery. The map was confiscated from him within an hour. The next day he was reassigned to a monastery in Umbria. He never returned to Rome, but 10 years later a visiting scholar claimed to have observed the parchment in a private study room. He remembered the angel's wing and the ash still clinging to the paper. He also remembered something else. When he held the parchment under a special lamp used to study watermarks, a second set of lines appeared. Lines not drawn with ink, but etched into the fibres themselves. They formed a ring, and within that ring was a single word, too faint to be sure. Some believe it read fall, others argue it wasn't Latin at all. In this evening's tale, maps do not lead us to treasure. They lead us to silence, a silence so ancient it burns without flame, and somewhere beneath the Vatican that ring still waits, hidden beneath ash and stone, to mark the place where something ancient should never have been found. There's a small room just off the Sistine Chapel that most people have never heard of. It's quiet, windowless, and lined with red velvet. The church calls it the Room of Tears. It's the first place a newly elected pope is taken after the vote. There, he puts on his white vestments. There he takes a moment to breathe before stepping out onto the balcony. But many who have entered that room speak of something else, something they can't quite explain. The name Room of Tears wasn't given because of sorrow, but because almost every man who enters it cries. The moment the door closes behind them, the weight of centuries falls upon their shoulders. The silence inside is deep, like a cathedral made of cloth and memory, but sometimes that silence is broken. In 1978, when Cardinal Albino Luciani was elected Pope, he entered the Room of Tears, smiling. He was known to be a warm and humble man, but according to the tailor who helped him put on his cassock, something changed. The smile faded. His hands began to tremble. He turned to look behind him, even though the door was closed, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked, "Someone spoke?" The tailor said no one had, but the Pope's gaze didn't leave the far wall. He stood motionless for a long time. Then he turned and walked out to face the gathered people. 33 days later, he was dead. No autopsy was ever performed, and it wasn't the only time something unsettling happened in that chamber. In 2005, after Pope John Paul II's passing, the man chosen to take his place entered the Room of Tears. A Monsignor standing guard just beyond the threshold reported hearing a dull thud as if a massive object had fallen. When they burst open the door, the new pontiff was kneeling. Clutching his chest, he claimed the atmosphere had changed. That it felt denser, he didn't reveal to anyone else. But the Monsignor, many years later, wrote a single sentence in his personal diary. "The murmur does not come from within, but from below." The Vatican has never commented on these incidents. To the rest of the world, the Room of Tears is simply an ordinary room, But behind those crimson curtains, a pattern emerges. Each time a new pontiff enters, he is left alone for a few minutes, just enough time to reflect, just enough time to listen. In this section of our nightly story, the enigma is not found in an ancient crypt or behind a locked door. It's found in a soundproof chamber where the atmosphere holds memory, a velvet-lined room wrapped in silence and watched by something not in the pictures, something that has seen every pontiff and awaits the next. At the deepest level, beneath the apostolic palace, there is a door that has never been opened in living memory, not because it is blocked or damaged, but because it was not meant to be opened by mortal hands. It is isolated, built of dark iron and stone, and in the centre it has a circular slab instead of a lock. But there is no key. There never has been. It was first documented in 1929 during a structural investigation after the Lateran Pacts. A group of engineers inspecting the palace foundations located the passage behind an unstable wall. At the end of the tunnel stood the door, smooth, cold, and sealed. The engineer in charge, a certain Arturo Leone, reported that it had no hinges or joints along the edges. It seemed to have emerged from the stone itself. Intrigued, they called the blacksmiths. One after another they examined the mysterious lock in the centre of the door. There was no latch to turn, no slot to align. One man claimed the metal reacted to touch, growing cold when he placed his hand on it. Another swore he heard a deep hum coming from behind the door, like wind whistling through an empty conduit. But there was no draught. Finally, the head of the Vatican blacksmiths was summoned. His name was Matteo Grassi. He had served 3 pontiffs and was capable of forcing anything open. He studied the lock for hours, trying tools and light. Then, without explanation, he packed up his equipment and refused to return. When asked why, he only replied, "It's not locked, it's sealed. This is different." From that day on, the Vatican placed guards near the door. No one attempted to open it again, but there was one particular request in 1971. A Jesuit scholar, Father Luca Bramante, asked to examine the lock using a device that detected electromagnetic pulses. He believed the door might react to something alive. His request was granted. He performed the test at night, in absolute silence. What he discovered was never disclosed, but fragments of his diary later emerged. In them, he wrote, "It reacts to presence, not pressure. It recognizes thought. It doesn't open because it senses our fear." Father Bramante left Rome shortly after. His room in the Jesuit residence was found empty. On his desk was a single sentence, written in impeccable handwriting. "Some doors are meant to remain closed, not to keep us out, but to hold something in." The door is still there, untouched, immaculate, and the lock remains in the centre, waiting for a key that doesn't exist. In this nightly story, the enigma is not what lies behind the door. It's why the Church has decided never to force it open. Perhaps they already know what awaits them on the other side, or perhaps, in their deepest prayers, they hope never to find out. In the quiet and silence of the Vatican's secret archives, behind a shelf no longer catalogued, lies a letter sealed with red wax. It is addressed to no one, bears no signature, but the parchment is thick. Faded ink in the upper corner, carefully written, bears a note that reads, "Do not open until the veil is lifted." The date written below is March 1944. The author was Pope Pius X. This letter was never sent. No one outside the Church's inner circle knew of its existence until it was discovered by chance in 2002. A young archivist who was examining ancient correspondence for preservation opened a drawer marked "empty" and found the sealed document between 2 wooden boards. The envelope was dry but heavy, and the seal was still intact. He handed it in, expecting it to be filed, but a senior official read the outside note and recognized the handwriting. The letter had not been lost, it had been hidden. The contents were finally read, not aloud, but in private, by a small committee of church historians. There is no official record of their meeting, but a priest, years later, recounted what he remembered before he died. The letter, he said, was not written as a traditional document, it was more of a warning. Pope Pius IX spoke of a presence held below, not by chains, but by will. He called it "she who is beneath Michael's chain," an expression never explained in any doctrine. Michael, the archangel, is known for casting down the fallen, but this was different. This presence, the pontiff wrote, was not cast down with violence, but lowered with an agreement, a being who had been persuaded, or perhaps even tricked, into being sealed. The letter described a growing pressure beneath the Vatican, not a physical force, but something spiritual. A vibration perceived in prayer, the Pope wrote. There is something moving beneath, as if remembering it was once light. He asked the next generation of church leaders to do 3 things: guard the crypt, silence the archives, and never attempt the rite of unbinding. As far as we know, that rite is not in any known Vatican text. The letter ends with a final line, underlined twice in blue ink. Not all angels rose in glory, some fell into silence, and it is silence that must be preserved. The Church has made no further comments. The letter has been resealed and placed in a box with the sole inscription, Veil. The box has not been opened again. In this section of our nightly story, we find not a document of faith, but of fear, a message from a pontiff to no one, written not solemnly, but with silent urgency. Whatever truth it tried to convey, it was not meant for the public. It was meant for those who already knew what lay beneath and who were trying, with all their might, to forget it. It was the spring of 1939 and Rome was silent. The world was on the brink of war, and within the Vatican walls the Church was preparing for the passing of a pontiff. Pius V had died in February, and a few weeks later his successor, Pope Pius XV, was elected. It was a time of transition, of prayer, of reflection. But one March morning, something happened beneath Vatican Hill that was never spoken of in any homily or news. Something that left a crack not only in the stone but also in the silence of the church at 4:23 in the morning. A deep rumble shook the foundations of St. Peter's Basilica, not strong enough to wake the city, but deep, like an underground drum roll. A guard stationed near the east corridor of the archive felt the ground give way beneath his boots. Dust fell from the ceiling. A lamp flickered and went out. He immediately reported the tremor. But when city officials consulted with the Italian Geological Institute, they found nothing. No earthquake had been recorded anywhere in or around Rome that night. The earth, they said, had not moved. And yet, beneath the basilica, something had moved. The guard, a young Swiss recruit named Matthias Vogel, was ordered to remain silent. But he kept a private diary, written in meticulous handwriting and hidden behind the false lining of his locker. That March entry described much more than just shaking walls. He wrote that, as he approached the east wing of the archives, he had heard a sound like a metallic wail, a slow, dragging noise like a chain scraping over stone. When he reached the last door on the lower floor, he found it slightly ajar. That door hadn't been opened in decades. He stepped forward, holding his lantern high. What he saw, he would never forget. The corridor beyond the door, always sealed, was now covered in a fine grey dust, but in the centre, on the floor, there was a single line, not drawn, but burned, as if something red-hot had passed through it, leaving a trail. He didn't dare follow it. Instead, he backed away and closed the door. At dawn, the area was cordoned off. A small group of officials arrived silently and sealed the corridor with iron bolts. A maintenance record shows that new supports were installed that same day, although no damage was officially recorded. Vogel remained on duty for another 6 months. Then he was transferred without notice. His diary was found years later by his nephew, who kept it hidden for fear of what it might mean. The last words of the March entry read, "It has awakened beneath us, not completely, not loudly, but it has moved." In this nightly story, we discover that even stone can tremble when something ancient moves beneath it. The Vatican has made no statements. The city continued to sleep, but the earth remembered, and so did the one watching from the darkness. In the quiet days after World War II, as the world slowly began to rebuild, something unusual happened inside the Vatican. It was not marked by trumpet blasts, nor by proclamations. There was no media coverage, no speech from the Holy Father, but for those who watched closely, the change was evident. In the first months of 1946, the number of Swiss guards on patrol within Vatican City quietly doubled. There was no official threat. There had been no attack. The war was over. And yet the presence of the guards, those tall, silent men in their brightly striped uniforms, suddenly became heavier, more vigilant. They began to be stationed in places they had never been before. Not just at the gates or in public halls, but also in the shadowy corners of the Apostolic Palace, near staircases that led nowhere, near rooms that were no longer used. It all began with a single order, issued by the papal chamber late in the evening, a note delivered personally to the commander of the Swiss Guard, ordered that double shifts be arranged in rotation, not along the outer walls, but deep beneath them. Specific locations were indicated: a corridor in the Eastern Archive, a staircase behind the sacristy, and the old passage that ran beneath the papal residence. Closed for over 100 years, the order came from Pope Pius XV himself. No explanation was given, but only a few weeks earlier, during a night inspection on the lower floors, something strange had happened. 2 guards, after a normal patrol, had not reported back. They were found hours later, silent at the end of a dark corridor, both pale and unblinking. When questioned, neither responded. One had dropped his halberd, though he didn't seem to notice. They were quietly removed and reassigned to a refuge in the Alps. One of the 2 never spoke again. Whispers among the guards spoke of an unseen figure in the darkness, of a pressure in the air that grew heavier the longer one stayed near the ancient stone. One account, never made public, described hearing voices, not screams, not wails, but something fainter, like a prayer in a language no one recognized. From that moment on, the Vatican's security apparatus changed, not outwards, but inwards. Guards began to train not only in defense, but also in silence, endurance, and obedience to orders they were never allowed to question. No bulletins were issued, no foreign power was accused, and yet more guards appeared each week. By the end of that year, the number of Swiss guards patrolling the Vatican was almost double what it had been before. Some believed the measure was to protect the pontiff from external dangers, but others, those who worked the night shifts, those who stood guard in the forgotten corners of the Vatican's foundations, thought very differently. They were not protecting the pontiff from what might have happened. They were protecting the world from what might have tried to get out. In this section of our nightly story, protection does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means keeping something very old and very patient. In the night, exactly where it is, there is a section of the Vatican archives that is not on any map, is not mentioned in official documents, and is never shown to visiting scholars. It is only known by whispers among some ecclesiastics and archivists, and even they speak of it in hushed tones. This place has a name, passed down through generations, behind closed doors and silent prayers. It's called the Black Archive. The Black Archives aren't part of the Secret Archive, which is already hidden from public view. They are even below it, on a level only accessible through a private elevator that requires 2 keys, one held by the archive's prefect and the other by an ancient member of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Only these two can grant access. Not even the Holy Father can enter alone. These archives are where the Church keeps its most unsettling documents, not forgotten relics of wars or ancient heresies, but something more dangerous, evidence of things the Church has witnessed but never explained. Failed exorcisms, objects that moved untouched, testimonies of priests who claimed to hear voices during Mass, not from the choir, but from beneath the altar. The oldest documents date back to the early 16th century, when the Vatican began collecting these strange accounts, but the section known as the Black Archive was sealed in its current form in 1932. That was the year the Church officially recognised in private that not all possessions were caused by demons. Some were caused by something else. An archivist, Father Silvano Rossi, worked on the lower floors for over 20 years. He was quiet, devout, and trusted by everyone. But in the winter of 1979, he left a message in the margin of a catalogue entry written in red ink. It read, "The voice in room B is not human. It speaks Latin backward, but it breathes between words." He disappeared 3 days later. His room was found in perfect order, his books left open as if he had only stepped away for a moment. The Vatican never acknowledged his disappearance. Inside the Black Archives, folders aren't labelled with names or dates, they're marked with a symbol, a circle within a square, a faceless winged figure, a chain of 7 links. There's one that no one has spoken aloud, a triangle filled with thorns etched into the cover of a leather-bound journal, which remains closed. Those who have seen these documents speak of a strange feeling when handling them, as if the paper itself resisted being read, as if some truths didn't want to be revealed. In this section of our bedtime story, knowledge isn't light, it's a weight, stifled in silence and hidden behind closed doors. And the Vatican, with all its cathedrals and candles, still clings to this darkness, not to protect itself, but perhaps to protect all of us. It was a cold February morning in 1962 when a priest from the Umbrian Hill parish arrived in Rome with a letter sealed with wax and slightly trembling hands. His name was Father Domenico Ferri. In his letter, he described in detail a case he couldn't explain, a case the local bishop had advised him not to speak of, not even in confession. The Vatican assigned it a number and stored it in a folder marked with a single black ring. That folder became known as File 204. The subject of the case was a woman named Elena Vasari. She lived alone in a quiet stone house on the outskirts of her village. She was well liked, had never married and had no known medical history. But something changed after her younger brother disappeared. She started talking in her sleep. They weren't soft murmurs, but full sentences. Some in languages no one recognised, others in strange, overlapping echoes, as if two voices spoke simultaneously from within her. The local priest tried prayer, then holy water, then silence, but the disturbances continued. Elena began writing things in chalk on the walls, symbols no one could decipher, swirling lines shaped like wings. When asked what they meant, she replied, "Now he is remembering, no one knew who he was." Father Ferri documented everything, including an episode where Eleanor stood outdoors during a storm, barefoot, and whispered something to the wind. Lightning struck a tree 10 meters away. She didn't blink. The Vatican examined the file in secret. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith requested 3 observers be sent, 2 experts in exorcism and 1 in ancient languages. They arrived silently and stayed for 6 days. On the 3rd night, the observers heard Elena speak again in her sleep. One of them recorded her. The voice was slow and quiet, but it had a weight, like a stone in water. Roughly translated, it said, "The brother of light now has no name, only a chain." When later asked what it meant, Elena replied, "He is beneath Rome. He is not dead. He is just waiting." On the last night, Elena woke up screaming, but without feeling pain. She said something had touched her forehead and that her name was written backward in the air. After that, she fell into a deep sleep and remained in that state for 3 days. She woke up with no memory of the events. The Vatican closed the case without making any statements. The observers were reassigned. One of them, a young linguist named Father Tommaso Bevilacqua, left the church within a year. His last letter home mentioned voices echoing under the stone halls, naming names not written in scripture. File number 204 lies forgotten in the darkest archives. Never publicly mentioned in this bedtime story, the enigma doesn't arise from forgotten ruins or dusty ancient manuscripts. It arises from the living, from words that should be silenced, from an identity that should remain unknown. Yet, once spoken, it persists. Stored in a climate-controlled room beneath the Apostolic Palace, protected in a leather pouch marked with the word reserved, rests a volume almost no one has consulted. The outer wrapping is plain and unadorned, yet its pages enclose doctrines passed down only in the most remote passages of the Vatican. This is not a public text, nor even accessible to most clergy. This represents the private Vatican protocol for ritual confinement, a document reserved exclusively for those instructed in the Church's most hidden ceremonies. Unlike more widespread exorcist manuals, this one does not deal with warding off dark entities. Its purpose differs radically. Its pages describe coercion, not expulsion, sealing, not purification. The heading on the initial page is written in Latin, roughly translatable as precepts for retaining what was rejected by the light. It was compiled in the early 20th century, but some sections come from earlier sources, including a 16th century missive discovered among the annotations in a missing bishop's diary. The missive warned of a presence in the bowels of the Vatican, an entity once considered divine, now silent. The manual calls it the Delegate. In its pages are diagrams of ceremonial circles, constructed not with wax but with ferrous metal. Salt is used, but only if amalgamated with oil extracted from olive trees grown in the shade of certain heights. Formulas are listed not to expel presences, but to pacify something already buried. There is a page, marked with a crimson ribbon, containing a single phrase. Do not invoke its identity. Remember who last invoked it in the year 1975. A young ecclesiastic named Father Emilio Sartori gained access to the manual during training in the suburbs of Rome. He later noted in his private diary that the text vibrated when he touched it. He was convinced that the manual itself held something inside, something that was watching him. On the third day of study, he found a hidden message among the last pages. It was handwritten, dated in the early 40s. It read, "The rite must not be practiced outside the chamber. If the bond yields, the burden will return to the world." Father Sartori tried to question his superiors, but was ordered never to mention the manual again. Within a month, he requested a transfer. His last sermon, delivered in a nearly deserted church, concluded with these words, "There are locks not forged by man, and keys that are not metal. There is no reference to the manual in public church documents. It does not appear on the list of forbidden texts, and yet it exists, page after page, penned by men who believed they were guarding not an illusion but a threshold." In this bedtime story, Vatican mysteries are not hidden in legends. They're transcribed in silent environments, protected by muteness, and passed down to those who will never speak of them again. It was the night of October 3rd, 1978. The sky over Rome was clear. Not a cloud, not a breath of wind. The constellations were fixed in a pale blue firmament. And yet, shortly before midnight, a single rumble echoed among the rooftops, not from above, but from the depths of the Vatican Hill. Something unusual was happening within the Vatican walls. No bells were ringing, no lights illuminated the great halls. The gates of St. Peter's Basilica remained closed, but in a reserved chapel far below ground, a group of men dressed in black had gathered in silence. There were 7 of them, all Jesuit priests. None of them had an identity recorded in the public archive. The only testimony of the event subsists in a half-burnt page found inside an abandoned maintenance log. The annotation, written by an electrician assigned to the lower levels, reads, "Entry forbidden at Gate 11. I have heard chanting. The light was flickering. Something was stirring behind the rock." That same night, a single oil lamp burned in the underground chapel, a lamp that had not been used for over 200 years. It was placed next to an iron-bound book, open on a marble table marked with 3 circles. What happened during those hours has never been verified, but fragments have emerged from separate accounts, pages found torn from private diaries, whispered confessions by former members of the clergy, and an anonymous letter left inside the wall of a small church on the outskirts of the city. The rite performed that night was not an exorcism, it was something more archaic. The name of the ceremony is missing from the records, as if it had been erased, but a single phrase was repeated in all texts. "May what has fallen remain bound. May it dream, but never speak." Witnesses claim that a noise came from the lower chamber during the last moments of the ceremony. Not a scream, not a voice, but the rustle of wings brushing against the rock. No one can confirm what generated it. In the morning, the chapel had been emptied, the lamp had gone out, and the 7 priests were never seen again. The next day, the newly elected pontiff, John Paul I, was found dead in his room. Official reports indicated cardiac arrest, but a servant noticed a strange expression on his face. Not suffering, not terror, but melancholy. His disappearance, occurring only 33 days after the start of his pontificate, has always raised questions. But within the Vatican walls few dare to link it to what happened underground. In this part of our bedtime story, the rite was not aimed at defeating something, but at postponing it, and when prayers are whispered in secret rooms, it is not always for redemption. Sometimes it is for muteness, sometimes it is for slumber, and sometimes it is to prevent something ancient from waking. He was an unknown priest. His name never appeared in the press or in official Vatican documents, but those who knew him said he was kind, patient, and deeply devoted to his mission. His name was Father Luciano Ventresca, and for over 20 years he served in the Vatican archives, specializing in music and liturgy. He catalogued ancient hymns, translated Gregorian chants, and restored manuscripts so old that their pages crumbled with a breath. He loved sounds, he loved order, and then, one day, he stopped speaking forever. It all began during a week of deep restoration work in the lower halls of the Apostolic Library. Father Ventresca had been asked to examine a sealed box discovered behind a damaged bookshelf. The box was wrapped in velvet and bore an unknown symbol, a downward-pointing wing, surrounded by 7 small circles. There was no trace of who had placed it there, or when it had arrived. Inside were sheets of music, hand-copied in black ink. The notes were written in a style unknown even to scholars of ancient Roman chant. Each line curved in unusual directions, crossing and wrapping like threads. Some notes were shaped like wings, others looked like chains. There was no text, only a phrase, repeated in the margin. It was never silence. Father Ventresca spent 3 nights studying the music. On the 4th, he was found in his room, sitting in a wooden chair, eyes open and mouth closed. When asked a question, he blinked, but said nothing. Doctors examined him. There were no signs of trauma. He could move, breathe, and eat, but he never spoke again. This happened in the spring of 1983. What made the case strange was not just his muteness, but what he had left behind. In the margin of his notebooks, there were sketches, not of instruments, but of rooms, circular underground chambers, with dark pits in the centre. Around the pits were what looked like small figures, some kneeling, others with their wings lowered, as if hiding their faces. There was also a single line written on his desk, traced in red chalk. It was music, but not for us. The Vatican acted quickly. Father Ventresca was quietly removed and transferred to a monastery in northern Italy. His notebooks were confiscated, his materials sealed. The music he had studied was never catalogued. The velvet box was returned to storage, though no one knows exactly where. Years later, a monk who had cared for Father Ventresca said that the priest hummed softly to himself at night, but the melodies were never familiar. They seemed slow, heavy, and tuneless. Like a wordless morning, the monk said. In this bedtime story, sound is not always a gift. Sometimes it is the memory of a place that should never have been heard, and sometimes he who listens too closely loses not only his voice, but also the silence that protected him. In a city where every whisper echoes against marble and stone, silence is more than a custom. In the Vatican, silence is a code. It's used not just to avoid scandal, but to guard the boundaries of mystery. And when it comes to the deepest secrets, the ones the Church never writes down, there are 3 layers of silence, each heavier than the last. The first layer is public silence. This is what the world sees. It's the quiet denial, the firm rejection, the simple statement that nothing unusual has happened. This is the kind of silence used when reporters ask about a closed corridor or a sealed book. It's the polite smile of a cardinal who says, "We don't talk about that." Most people stop here, and that's the point. The second layer is academic misdirection. This is where the truth turns to dust. Documents are moved, names are changed, dates are shifted just enough to confuse. A priest assigned to a specific case might find his papers have vanished. A researcher digging into an ancient ritual might discover the original text has been temporarily removed. When asked about these changes, archivists shrug slightly. Perhaps the pages are being restored. Perhaps they were lost during the war. But no one ever finds them again. Father Lorenzo Berardi once tried to write a study on unexplained 17th century rites. He found references to a ritual known only as the containment of light, but each time he requested more documents, his letters went unanswered. Eventually, he was told the ritual didn't exist, yet he had already seen it mentioned in 3 different books. A week later, one of those books had disappeared from the Vatican library. The others had their pages bound. The chapter he had read was gone. The third and final layer is the deepest, the internal denial. Here, silence becomes part of the body. Priests who find something they can't explain are often reassigned, not for failure, but to protect them. Confessions are never written down. Dreams are ignored. If a voice is heard in the night, it's labelled as fatigue. If a shadow moves for no reason, it's called imagination. And if a priest keeps talking about these things, he's gently retired, put into silent service, or sent to a monastery where silence is permanently encouraged. This third silence is the most dangerous, not because it hides something evil, but because it hides something real, something that doesn't disappear when we stop talking about it. Some say the Church fears scandal, others say it fears doubt, but those who have been near the locked doors in the depths of the Vatican Hill will tell you otherwise. The Church keeps silent not from fear of what people might say, but from fear that if it speaks too loudly, something from below might answer. And in this bedtime story, silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the sound waiting behind the silence. There's a small leather-bound book kept under lock and key in the papal apartment. It's not part of any official archive, and no one speaks openly about it. Only the few who have borne the weight of the white robe know of it, and even they have read it only once. The book is a handwritten diary, its entries marked with dates and stained with what appear to be fingerprints left in prayer or pain. Within its pages is a single note, anonymous, but clearly in the handwriting of Pope John Paul I. He was pontiff for only 33 days in 1978. His papacy ended as quietly as it began, but but in the short time of his rule, something changed in him. Those closest to him said he seemed carefree upon his arrival, with a kind, even playful smile at times. But after a visit to the archives beneath the Vatican Hill, something in his gaze became heavy. He became less talkative, more thoughtful, as if he'd seen something that had etched itself into his mind. The note in the diary is brief. It reads, "Some angels we should never have redeemed." There's no explanation, no context, but it's written on a page all its own, dated just 5 days before his death. What he saw in those final days remains unknown, but records show he spent almost 2 hours in a room beneath the Apostolic Palace. Closed for many years, the only other visitor mentioned that day was an elderly archivist named Cardinal Balestra, who later only said, "His Holiness asked pertinent questions, but some doors should remain closed." The morning after his visit, Pope John Paul I cancelled 2 meetings. Instead, he asked for silence. He spent the entire day in prayer. Later that week, he wrote letters to several people, including one to a childhood friend in Veneto. That letter was never sent, but it was found on his desk after his death. It said only this: "The stories we ignored as children are true. The stars are not alone." The official cause of death was a heart attack. No autopsy was performed. However, his loved ones described no signs of physical illness, only a spiritual weight that grew heavier and heavier with each passing day. In this bedtime story, a pope isn't just a leader, he's a witness, and sometimes he sees what the rest of the world isn't ready to know. Regret, for him, isn't for mistakes made, but for truths discovered, truths too old, too powerful, too dangerous to be revealed aloud. And so he left only one sentence, a single verse that would echo in the silence. "Some angels we should never have redeemed." He was known by his name, but only as Father X, an old exorcist called to the Vatican one winter afternoon in 1992. He was summoned in secret, flown from a remote parish in southern Spain, where he had worked for decades without attracting attention. He was said to be quiet, faithful, and unyielding in the face of the strange voices he had encountered before. But even he wasn't prepared for what the Vatican had asked of him that night. They didn't call it an exorcism. They called it a listening. He was led deep into the Apostolic Palace, past nameless corridors and doors that hadn't opened in years. The air grew colder as they descended, and the silence wasn't empty. It was dense, as if sound itself had been swallowed. At the last door, 2 guards stood impassively. The priest was handed a scroll and told to read it once inside the room. He wasn't told what the ritual meant or where it came from, but as he read the words, he noticed something strange. They weren't prayers of expulsion. They weren't pleas for mercy. They were instructions for silence. He entered the chamber alone. What happened in that room was never recorded, but when he emerged, almost an hour later, his hands were trembling. He refused to speak for 2 days. When he finally spoke again, he did so only to one man, a Vatican historian who secretly took notes. Those notes remained hidden in the black archives until they resurfaced in a collection of classified texts years later. On the last page was a single line, quoted directly from the old priest's mouth. "This isn't demonic. It's heavenly rot. Remember before we were born." Heavenly rot. It was a phrase no one had heard before, not in scripture or any known theological text. Yet it carried meaning, heavy and cold. It didn't suggest evil born of temptation, but light that had been corrupted. Something once holy, now hopelessly broken. The priest never returned to his old parish. He spent the rest of his days in silence in a monastery in Umbria, refusing even to utter his own name. When asked why he had descended, he simply whispered, "They sent me to listen, and I heard too much." In this bedtime story, not all voices come from darkness. Some fall from the sky, distorted by time and silence. Some are older than the stars, and when the Church listens too closely, it uncovers truths that don't fit into the prayers of men. The warning was clear. What waits beneath the Vatican isn't something to cast out. It's something waiting to be remembered. It sits behind glass in a climate-controlled room, buried on the deepest level of the Vatican archives, surrounded by ancient scrolls, handwritten gospels, and forbidden manuscripts. At first glance, it looks like just another old book. The cover is blackened leather, thick and worn with age, stitched at the edges with wire instead of thread. But this one is different. It has no title on the spine, no author on the page, and even stranger, no visible way to open it. There's no clasp, no lock, no seam along the side. Still, the Vatican clearly labels it in gold ink, Decadentis Stella. In Latin, that means of the fallen star. Few have touched it, even fewer have tried. Those who did described a strange feeling the moment their fingers brushed the surface, like the skin shifted slightly, as if it breathed. In 1959, a scholar from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith got rare permission to examine the book. He brought delicate tools, gloves, and a sense of great care. But no matter how he tried, the book wouldn't open. Not with pressure, not with heat, not even by carefully cutting along the seam. After 3 hours he gave up, but what bothered him most wasn't the silence of the pages, it was what happened when he put the book back down. The table underneath was scorched as if branded by heat, though the book remained cold. Later that year, the scholar left the Vatican unexpectedly. His last written message remains in his personal file. It reads, "It is not locked. It is sealed. And the seals are not broken. They have been shattered. The book has remained untouched to this day. Some whisper it holds the true names of those cast out of heaven. Others believe it's not a book at all, but a prison in book form, meant to guard the essence of something ancient, something not entirely dead. No one knows how the book arrived at the Vatican. Its first known record dates back to the early 15th century in a shipping manifest from a burned monastery in eastern France. That monastery no longer exists. It was reduced to ashes by a fire that left no cause. In this bedtime story, even a book can be a door, and sometimes the pages you can't turn still carry weight. A weight that hangs through the centuries, waiting for hands bold or reckless enough to try. However, the Vatican doesn't even try anymore. That sealed book isn't looking for a reader. It's waiting for something else, something entirely different. He had dedicated over 40 years of his life to the archives. A quiet person, soft-spoken with measured gestures. They called him Brother Matteo, and though few knew him outside those walls, within the Vatican, he was nicknamed the Custodian. He knew every corridor, every ancient document, every writing by heart, but there was one area of the archives he never spoke about, not even when asked directly. It was a narrow passage, hidden behind a false bookshelf, tucked away beyond records of forgotten assemblies and unsaid liturgies. Brother Matteo called it the Black Shelf. It didn't appear on any official map. Yet, it had always been there, covered in dust and shrouded in darkness. It guarded only 4 items. The most famous was the leather-bound volume called Decadentis Stellae, the Tome of the Fallen Star. But there was a deeper reason Matteo stayed away. He remembered perfectly the day that shelf was revealed to him. It was the winter of 1967, a freezing day even by Vatican standards. He had followed an elderly archivist down the corridor past locked chambers and spaces lit by flickering flames. The old man stopped in front of the shelf, turned slowly and said, "Do not touch them, not even to dust them. Be watchful, and if you hear a voice, leave." Matteo politely smiled, thinking it was a joke, until the whisper came. One night he was alone, busy filing restoration notes after a small flood in the library downstairs. He had passed the shelf without thinking, walking quickly when he heard it, just once, a voice. Not loud, but very close, right next to his ear. It had spoken his name. He froze. The hallway was deserted. The door remained closed, and yet the voice had been clear. He couldn't sleep that night and never entered that hallway again. He assigned others to clean that area. He moved the volumes so he wouldn't have to pass by there anymore. Years later, when a visiting bishop asked him why that section had remained untouched, Brother Matteo simply replied, "Certain shelves don't exist to preserve knowledge. They exist to hold back what should never be discovered." What made this part of the archives particular wasn't just the age of the texts, but the feeling they gave off, as if they didn't belong to any era, as if they came before the church itself. In this bedtime story, silence doesn't always mean no noise. Sometimes it's the space where something waits, listening for a name, waiting for someone to forget the warning. The custodian never forgot. He simply chose not to talk about it, and sometimes that's exactly what keeps the door sealed. He was 93 when he finally asked for a tape recorder. The room was dim, lit only by a small oil lamp near the bed, and the heavy curtains remained drawn, as if the outside world no longer belonged to him. Cardinal Lorenzo Valeri had served the church for over 60 years, most of them in silence, most of it in the darkness of the Vatican's most secret chambers. At one time, he had been a promising member of the Holy See, a man entrusted with keys whose existence very few knew about. But time had taken his voice, his energy, and now, at the end, only memories remained. On a cold January morning in 1981, he made a weak gesture to the young priest assigned to assist him. With trembling fingers, he brushed the edge of the recorder, then nodded once. The priest, unsure what to expect, pressed record. What followed was soft, slow, and almost imperceptible, but every word was clear. "It's not a mystery," the cardinal murmured. "What we guard under the stone is a prisoner." Then he stopped, as if fearing those words might have a consequence. The room remained still. He continued, "We have built walls around it, solid and consecrated. We have placed symbols, carved prayers into the rock. But it does not sleep. It doesn't truly sleep. It waits and remembers every face that has passed its door." The young priest leaned closer. "What is it, Eminence?" The cardinal opened his eyes, only a silver glint beneath his eyelids. "You call it a fallen angel, but it is older than the fall, older than the names we have assigned to heaven and hell. It did not rebel, it was cast down for another reason." The priest asked what that reason was. The old man did not answer. Instead, Cardinal Valeri stated, "The Church has not buried history, it has sealed it, and the Vatican is not the guardian of truth. It is the guardian of something the world cannot bear to know." At the end of the recording, the room fell silent again. The cardinal spoke no more. By dawn, he was gone. The tape was sealed in an envelope marked for review only after my death. It was sent to the archives not with the scriptures, but with a file titled Non-Canonical Events. It has never been publicly heard, but those who have heard it claim his voice grew more intense when he spoke of the being behind the door, as if something within him had waited his whole life to tell the truth. In this bedtime story, the end of life is not always a peaceful passing. Sometimes it's the last chance to lift the veil, and sometimes what is revealed is not a mystery to protect, but a warning to pass on. The Church has not hidden a lie, it has sealed a truth that still watches us from below. It was hidden in a silent storage room beneath the Vatican museums, behind stacks of unusable paintings and sacred artifacts too worn or controversial to be displayed. The air smelled of dust and aged paint, and the only window was blocked by a thick slab of stone. There, hidden behind an unfinished nativity portrait, a young archivist discovered a canvas that had no cataloguing, no author, and no explanation for its presence. The painting was imposing, almost 8 feet tall, and covered by a heavy linen canvas yellowed with age. When the archivist removed it, she didn't call anyone. She just stood still, unable to breathe for several seconds. It was a portrait, but not of a saint, nor of Christ, nor of a known angel. It showed a figure with wide, broken wings, seated on a stone base, head bowed in darkness. Heavy, rusted chains hung from its arms and feet, though they were painted in such intense colours that you could almost hear them clinking. Its eyes weren't visible, hidden behind tangled hair and ash-like smudges, but there was something in its posture, something silent and unsettling. It wasn't a figure lifted in glory. It wasn't triumphant. It was waiting. Below, on the canvas, almost erased, was a small Latin inscription, Non pro adorare, sed pro custodire, not to worship, but to guard. The archivist reported the painting the next day. She registered it, as instructed, in the deposit catalogues. But 2 weeks later, when she returned with a restorer to assess its condition, the painting was gone. There was no trace of its movement, no signature on the transfer receipt. The linen canvas lay neatly folded on the floor, and nothing else remained. Later, the archivist would find a single annotation on the back of the painting's previous documentation, written in red pencil. It said only this: "Do not expose, lest faith turn to terror." There is no official statement from the Vatican about the painting's existence, but a retired museum official later shared a story whispered among the oldest staff, according to which, in the mid-20th century, Pope Pius X had personally ordered a work of sacred art to be removed from circulation after a visiting bishop fainted upon seeing it. According to reports, the bishop claimed the image matched a dream he had as a child, a dream of a chained angel, not in fire, but surrounded by ash. Not fallen for rebellion, but exiled for something older than judgment. In this bedtime story, even paint on canvas can hold a truth too heavy to be shown. Some images are not created to inspire faith. They are created to remind the observer of what lies behind them, and sometimes what we frame and hide in the dark corners of history is not forgotten. It just sleeps under the ash, waiting for the canvas to be lifted once more. In the spring of 1981, deep within the Vatican gardens, an old machine activated. It wasn't noisy, it didn't blink or hum, rather it drew a slow line on a strip of paper, drawing a wave that shouldn't be there. The Vatican seismograph had detected a tremor, but outside the ground hadn't moved. Rome remained quiet, the streets were silent. Not a single window shook, and no bell swayed in the towers of St. Peter's Basilica. Yet below, the machine recorded something precise, sudden and deep, a tremor without an epicenter. Father Aldo Farini, the Vatican's chief geoscientific consultant, examined the reading shortly before midnight. He had seen hundreds of these graphs over the years, mostly related to distant earthquakes or slight movements of the Roman bedrock. But this one was different. The frequency was low. The pressure, strange, came directly from beneath the hill, under the very heart of the Holy See. What disturbed Father Farini most was the silence. No other seismographic station in Rome had recorded anything. The next morning he took the graph to a private meeting with the Secretariat. He expected confusion or perhaps concern. He received instead a single instruction: file the report under infrastructure review and speak no more of it. But Father Farini couldn't let it go. A week later he conducted a silent test using a portable vibration sensor near the underground crypts. Nothing. Then again near the entrance to the oldest crypts. Still nothing. But when he approached a forgotten staircase behind the chamber of the apostles, the device clicked, a brief impulse, as if something had moved and right beneath his feet. 2 days later he was transferred to the Pontifical Academy in Florence. His access to the lower archives was denied without explanation. A new guard was placed in the basement where the seismograph was located, and the next roll of paper disappeared before it could be catalogued. Among the few who had seen the original graph, rumours began to circulate. A librarian claimed to have seen a shadow near the altar after morning prayer. A Swiss guard reported a faint hum in the walls, like music playing underwater. A sister, older than most remembered, simply said, "It moves when it remembers." No official statement was ever issued. The Vatican said nothing, and in the decades that followed, the 1981 event became just another buried line in a file, but the machine still waits in the dark, still listening, still ready to draw a line when the ground moves beneath secrets too old to be spoken. In this bedtime story, it's not always earthquakes that shake the earth. Sometimes what moves beneath our feet is not rock, but something once sealed that slowly awakens after centuries of stillness. It all began on a warm summer evening in Rome, June 22nd, 1983. A 15-year-old girl named Emanuela Orlandi never returned home from her music class. That evening she had left the family apartment, owned by the Vatican, with a flute case in hand and plans to meet friends later. But as the sun set and she didn't appear, her name became a whisper that still floats among the walls of the Holy City. The Vatican issued a brief statement. Missing, perhaps kidnapped, but no one claimed responsibility. And as the days passed, the silence from within the Vatican grew louder than any search outside. Emanuela's face was plastered on posters, seen in shop windows and bus stops. But behind the thick walls of the Holy See, there was no explanation, only silent meetings, closed doors, and a growing shadow. Her case remained open, but no trace of her was ever found. Years later, in 2004, a retired Vatican archivist named Father Luca Vieri mentioned something in a private conversation with an investigator. He said that the girl's disappearance had been linked in the past, not publicly, but secretly, to a specific passage in the Apostolic Archive. A sealed stone corridor from the early 20th century, a corridor that once connected the lower storerooms to an old staircase, now gone from all maps. He cautiously said that after Emanuela's disappearance, that section of the archive was permanently sealed, not reopened, not remodelled, but sealed. The priest remembered because he had once helped transport documents through that corridor, and after it was sealed, those documents were never moved again. He also remembered the name whispered during that period by an elderly Monsignor, a name that didn't belong to any member of the Curia. They called him the girl's guardian. What this meant was never clear, but around 1980, several guards were assigned to that level. Their presence wasn't explained to the staff. No one was allowed near the passage. One guard was replaced after only a month. He refused to talk about what he had seen. He left Rome 2 days later. Then came the story of the voice. One night, a worker passing through the secondary chambers claimed to have heard someone softly calling from behind the wall. He thought it might be a trapped nun or a lost visitor. He listened, but the voice didn't speak again, it only breathed. That area was put under restrictions for the week. Emanuela's family is still searching, still asking questions. But in this night's story, the mystery might not be on the surface, but underground, in corridors forgotten by time, in rooms that never appeared on any Vatican blueprint. And behind one of those doors, a truth might still be hidden in the darkness, patient like stone. Not all disappearances lead away from the Vatican, some lead down. It happened in the winter of 1979, in the last hours of a cold December night. While much of Rome slept, wrapped in silence and candlelight, a small group of priests moved silently through the stone corridors of the Vatican. They weren't walking in procession, nor were they wearing the vibrant colours of celebration. Their vestments were black, simple, without symbols. The public Christmas Mass had already been held. The faithful had come and gone, but this gathering, unrecorded by any official document and invisible to the public eye, was said to have taken place in the lower church, beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. A single witness, a former seminarian who later left the church, once described what he saw from a high staircase, hidden in the shadows. He didn't intend to be there. He had gone down after hearing a faint chant, words that didn't match any known liturgy. He described the priests as initially silent, arranged in a wide circle around a raised stone platform. In the centre was a sealed object. Some said it was a reliquary. Others believed it had no sacred origin. Covered in linen and ash, it emitted no light, it didn't move, but the surrounding air was strange. There was no sermon, no offering, only a reading in a language the witness couldn't identify. It wasn't Latin, it wasn't Greek, something else, something older. Then came the sound, the first strange event, a low hum like wind trapped in a bell tower. It started without a precise source and faded just as quickly. The witness remembered the hairs on his arms standing up, even though the crypt was icy and still. One of the black-robed priests stepped forward, touched the sealed object, and whispered a single word. The others bowed their heads, and the witness quietly fled. The next morning, there was no trace of the midnight encounter. No cleaner had been scheduled, no liturgical materials recorded. The guards upstairs had been reassigned the night before, and none of the men who had entered the crypt were seen during prayer hours for the next 2 weeks. Years later, questioned privately, a retired cardinal hinted that the Mass was not a Mass at all. He called it a rite of containment, only to be performed when certain signs appeared, when silence was broken in the wrong places, when objects began to hum without being touched. When something sealed starts to move, no explanation was given for the purpose of the ritual, or why it was held at midnight, or why only a few black-robed Jesuits had been chosen. But in this night's story, not all encounters in the Vatican are meant to be seen. Some take place in the quietest corners of the church, under the light, under the stone, where shadows listen and history forgets. And sometimes even the holiest city in the world holds a secret mass for something it hopes will never wake up again. In a forgotten drawer of the Vatican archives, buried under layers of dust and decades of misfiled documents, lies a time-worn page torn from a leather-bound book. The title, written in faded ink, simply reads, "The Ritual of the Seven Rings." The page is fragile, its edges burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it without success. This document is not listed in any official Vatican catalogue. Its language is mostly Latin, although some phrases are written in a script that doesn't match any known language. The page doesn't mention exorcisms, it doesn't mention saints or demons. Instead, it describes a ceremony that isn't meant to expel, but to anchor. It's a rite of binding, not of liberation. According to the page, the rings aren't jewellery. They are circles drawn in ash, in salt, in oil, and in blood. Each circle must be placed at a precise distance, marked with signs that resemble ancient star patterns, patterns that no longer appear in the night sky. The ceremony begins in complete silence. During the drawing of the first 3 circles, no words can be spoken. Only at the end of the 4th can the formula be whispered. The expressions don't represent a request. They constitute a warning. What amplifies the disturbing nature of this strange custom is a hastily written note on the margin by an unknown hand. It reads, "Used only once, never moved again within the circles." That note, though concise, suggests something appalling. The idea that any entity held within those perimeters didn't remain inert. It resisted, it watched intently. A long time ago, a Vatican scholar named Brother Matteo discovered an allusion to the 7 circles in a different tome while studying the scrolls found in the Dead Sea. The expression appeared in a fragmentary portion of parchment, accompanied by symbols almost identical to those present in the diagram guarded and sealed by the Vatican. The moment Brother Matteo presented his revelation to his superior, he was ordered to leave the scroll room and never return. 21 days later, he left the priesthood without offering any justification. Other fragments of the same ceremony have reappeared in the most unexpected contexts. A French convent burned during the Revolution, a parchment scroll recovered from a ruined Ethiopian chapel, and a page hidden in the binding of a Renaissance Bible. Each fragment provides only the essential details to hint at a larger truth, without ever offering enough elements to understand the whole. Why was the ritual conceived? What purpose was it meant to serve? And why does the Vatican keep every documented copy hidden in different places, always preventing coordinated study? In this night's narrative, sometimes the greatest enigma isn't in the darkness itself, but in the meticulous construction of the locks that contain it. And if the 7 circles ever serve to seal something, the question we shouldn't ask is whether those circles still hold it, or if something inside is waiting. Every dawn, before the sun reaches the Roman rooftops and spreads its golden light over the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, a silent ritual takes place under the high altar. The atmosphere is icy, still heavy with the night's silence, and the faint tapping of footsteps echoes like whispers among the marble columns. Some priests arrive before tourists and faithful, kneeling for a silent prayer in the semi-darkness. This represents the most sacred hour, when the world has not yet awakened and the boundary between days seems fainter. However, for some, that silence has not always remained empty. On more than one occasion, over the years, a strange sound has been reported coming from the space beneath the altar itself. It's not the creaking of rock, nor the hum of a mechanism. It is faint, deep, and continuous. Some describe it as a vibration, others define it as a hum, similar to the distant note of a voice that always maintains the same tone. The sound doesn't react to movements or prayers, it simply exists and then dissolves as if it autonomously chooses when to manifest. A Monsignor, now retired, confessed to having perceived it for 3 consecutive dawns in a single week. Initially, he believed it was a trick of old age, but later a younger deacon, visiting for the first time, approached him with lost eyes and asked, "Do you feel it?" Both remained seated in silence, motionless in their seats, listening to something they couldn't name. The moment passed, and neither of them discussed it further until the Monsignor quietly retired from his duties. When asked, the Vatican makes no statements. Maintenance crews report no anomalies. The altar is sealed, centuries old, and consecrated with more ceremonies than any other structure in Christendom. But underneath there is an older passage. It connects to the ancient necropolis, those deep tombs where the bones of saints and martyrs rest in layers of darkness. Some of those passages haven't been touched since the time of Constantine. One theory, whispered by archivists who dedicate their lives in the bowels of Vatican Hill, holds that the sound is not earthly, not mechanical, nor even meant to be perceived. It's something that seeps in, like water finding a crack in the rock, and what it carries with it is not language, but presence. In this night's narrative, even the holiest place on earth has a beating heart beneath it, a heart hidden in the marble, in the centuries, in the secrets. And sometimes, if you wake up early enough, before the bells ring, you might catch the trace of a sound that shouldn't be there at all, not because it's dangerous, but because it reminds us of something the world has forgotten and continues to vibrate. There is a room deep within Vatican Hill that doesn't appear on most maps, isn't mentioned in visitor brochures or architectural plans. The priests who know about it rarely speak its name. They call it the Chamber of Vigil. Inside there is a single stone pedestal, circular and polished by time. On it lies an iron lamp, blackened by time and forged in the shape of an open eye. That lamp has a flame, not a candle, not electric lighting. A real, constant and soft flame that flickers with an amber glow that never goes out. The chamber is sealed. No window, no air movement, and no hint of fuel. Yet the flame persists. It has been burning longer than anyone can remember. A custodian who has cleaned the floors of the archive corridors for over 3 decades claims to have first observed the flame in the spring of 1962. He had been told never to ask questions, but every year when he passed that small steel door hidden behind a tapestry depicting the Last Supper, he felt a warmth on his face like the silent heat of a summer afternoon. When he finally retired, he whispered one thing to his successor: "It's always lit. Always." Several attempts have been made to document it, but the flame resists being captured. Photographs turn out dark or overexposed. Filming records only a flash of light, as if the fire isn't entirely present. There is no trace of who lit the flame, no voice in the archives, no mention in papal diaries. Some suggest it was part of an ancient ceremony meant to signal the presence of something held beneath. Others believe it is a sentinel lamp placed over a sealed door guarding something the Church has never dared to name. There is a hypothesis advanced only once in a private note found inside a locked drawer of the Apostolic Palace. It is that the flame doesn't burn with oil at all, it is burning a memory. This night's narrative leads us to a simple question in a city of cathedrals and candles, of consecrated oils and golden chalices. Why does a forgotten lamp remain lit, untouched and unexpressed in the heart of the oldest stone? Why has no one dared to put it out? Perhaps the answer lies in the air breathed in that room, still, unexplored, as if the flame not only measures time, but guards it. And perhaps, when the flame goes out, it won't mean the end of a fire, but the beginning of something waking up, something remembering when it wasn't alone beneath Rome. In the year 1767, a silent storm swept through the heart of the Catholic world. It didn't come with banners or swords, but with sealed letters, unsigned orders, and a sudden silence. Throughout Europe, the Jesuits, an elite religious order known for their loyalty, discipline, and deep expertise in theology and science, were being expelled, one country after another. Spain ordered them to leave, France followed, Portugal too, and behind every decision, behind every royal decree and every papal consent, there was a feeling that something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. The Vatican maintained that it was a political matter of power and pride, but in the long dark corridors of the Apostolic Palace someone whispered a different story. The night the order of expulsion was signed in Rome, a Jesuit superior of unknown identity was seen leaving the lower floors of the archive. His face was pale, his hands trembled, he carried a bag clutched to his chest, and he never returned. Days later, a parchment was found in the dust near a locked archive door. It was unsigned, water-damaged, and hard to read, but one sentence remained clear: "The bond has weakened, we cannot be blamed." For most, it meant nothing, just another puzzling note lost in the chaos of church politics. But for some archivists, those words carried weight. They knew of a place beneath the Vatican where rituals were once performed, not of worship, but of containment, a chamber older than the foundation stones themselves. And within that chamber, according to forgotten writings, something had been chained not with iron, but with prayer. The Jesuits have always been the keepers of forbidden knowledge. They guarded ancient texts, studied celestial mysteries, and trained in spiritual warfare. If they rebelled, or worse, failed, it could mean one of the Church's deepest secrets had been breached. Years later, after order was restored in the early 19th century, some of the expelled Jesuits returned. Their silence was absolute. They did not speak of what had happened during their exile. But one elderly priest, near death in a small Italian village, broke his vow. He only said this: "We were not punished, we were removed because we were afraid, and we were right." Tonight, as you rest and let history flow through your mind, imagine the heavy stillness of the Vatican's lower floors during those turbulent days. Imagine whispered prayers behind locked doors, symbols drawn in chalk, and an order of men tasked not with spreading the faith, but with keeping something in place, something that, if released, would not destroy the church, but reveal what it had guarded all along. And perhaps that is why the Jesuits were silenced, not because they had lost control, but because they had seen what truly lay beneath the Vatican and could no longer keep it secret. In the spring of 1894, the Vatican was abuzz with preparations. A new wing of the catacombs was to be opened for sacred visits. This lower level, rarely spoken of in public, lay beneath the Teutonic cemetery and had been untouched for over 100 years. It was once a burial ground for early Christians, but many said it had become something else, something the church kept away from sunlight and sermons. Pope Leo III, a man of great intellect and tradition, had agreed to bless the site. His advisers quietly planned the visit, away from public view. The Swiss Guard was informed, vestments were prepared, a short prayer was written, everything was in place. But the Pope never crossed the threshold. According to the records of one of his aides, the Holy Father arrived at the entrance with his entourage and stood still. He did not speak. His face, usually calm and serene, turned pale. He clutched his rosary tightly, his lips moving silently. Then, in a low voice, he gave an order that startled even the most seasoned guards. "Seal it up again," he said. "That place is not for us." He turned away. No blessing was given. No account of the visit was ever made public. The documents related to that day were filed away in the apostolic archives, but the aide, who lived to a ripe old age, left a personal note in a collection of journals. The note was brief, written in a shaky hand. It said, "He watched me through the stone. He said he smiled. That is all." From that day forward, no pope ever entered that section again. The door remained sealed, the hinges rusted behind blocks of marble. Tour guides avoided the corridor leading to it. Most cardinals wouldn't even speak of it. Some whispered that the room predated Christianity, carved by hands lost to history. Others believed it was one of the 7 dark rooms the early Vatican had sworn to keep hidden forever. And there's more. In 1912, a young seminarian cleaning the lower crypt claimed to have seen a candle flicker from the sealed doorway. He approached, thinking someone had been locked in, but as he drew near, the light vanished. In its place, he heard what he described as music, sweet, slow, in a language he could not comprehend. He never returned to that corridor. His testimony was quietly removed from seminary records. Yet the room remains untouched and undisturbed, not by chance, but by order. Whatever lies beneath that floor, behind that door, is part of the Vatican's deepest silence. A silence so heavy that even the Pope turned away. As you drift into this bedtime story, let the thought haunt you. Not everything sacred is meant to be revealed. Some secrets are older than cathedrals, and some doors are sealed. Not to protect what is outside, but to contain what waits within. In the silent depths of the Vatican Library, beyond the reading rooms and guarded corridors, there is a drawer that rarely sees the light. It has no label, no listing in any catalogue. Only 2 men at a time know its exact location, and even they do not speak of it except in whispers. Inside is a scroll so ancient that the paper crumbles like dry leaves at the slightest movement. It is called the Archangel Manuscript. This scroll, written in ink that seems to shift colour in the light, was discovered in the 16th century during an excavation near the old walls of Jerusalem. It was not found by chance. The team unearthing it worked under the secret direction of a Vatican envoy sent not to explore but to retrieve something hidden. Wrapped in linen canvas and sealed in a clay jar, the scroll was delivered directly to a Jesuit priest, who carried it in silence to Rome. The journey, some say, changed him. He arrived a silent man and died silently. The manuscript contains names. Some are familiar. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, but there is one that does not appear in scripture or sermon, a name erased from common telling. The scroll calls it the Other, a being whose role was neither purely sacred nor entirely fallen. It was said to walk between light and shadow, an observer with no allegiance. The Vatican attempted to translate its full contents, but the words would not yield. Linguists who worked on the text often spoke of dreams, some sweet, some disturbing. One man abandoned the project after claiming he heard voices whenever he touched the parchment. Another began drawing symbols he said he had never learned. What most disturbed the church was a single passage written almost in the centre of the scroll, roughly translated as recite. He who was not cast down, but chose descent. This was not Lucifer. It was someone else, an angel who had not been punished, but had made a choice, the choice to descend into the world beneath the world. The Vatican never confirmed this hypothesis. The scroll remains in the sealed drawer, protected by 3 locks. But those who have studied the ancient texts believe this manuscript may refer to a being so ancient and so misunderstood that even the early church fathers chose to forget it. Some whisper that the being mentioned in the Archangel manuscript is the one kept beneath the Vatican, not a demon, not a devil, but something far more difficult to explain, something ancient, something waiting. Tonight, as your eyes begin to feel heavy, imagine this forgotten name still faintly echoing in the stone vaults beneath Rome, not written in history books, but whispered in prayers never spoken aloud, a secret the Vatican will neither confirm nor deny, because some truths are kept hidden for the safety of all who sleep above. Rests in a display case no larger than a tray, a smooth disc carved from pure black obsidian, hidden deep within a storage chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace. No label, no explanation, just a silent note nearby, faded with time, that simply reads, "Do not touch under any light." To most people, it would appear to be just a polished stone, cold, flawless, almost beautiful. But to the handful of Vatican officials who have come near it, the disc is something else entirely, something older than the church itself, something that does not belong to the world above. In the winter of 1926, a German scholar named Heinrich Vollmar visited the Vatican at the invitation of a high-ranking Monsignor. He was not a priest, but an expert in ancient sound resonances. He had spent years studying the echoes of temples and how certain materials could capture vibrations like a memory. When he was led to the crypt and saw the obsidian disc, he said the air in the room changed, no longer colder nor warmer, just aware. As he reached his hand toward the disc, his instruments registered low-frequency vibrations, the kind that usually come from deep within the earth, but the Vatican was still. No machines, no movement, just the disc. His report, now sealed in the black archives, noted that the sound pattern pulsed at intervals, 7 long, 1 short. Then it repeated. It was not a natural rhythm. Some whispered it was not a message for us, that the disc had not been created by human hands, nor for human eyes. Some believed it was a seal, a kind of auditory keystone placed over something older than the basilicas themselves. Not a key, but a warning. In 1964, another test was secretly performed. A Jesuit engineer brought a radio wave emitter into the vault just to observe if the disc reacted. It did not glow, it did not move, it did not crack, but the machine nearby completely shut down, as if drained of power for the next 3 hours. The air in the vault remained thick, as if a storm had passed without wind or rain. Since then, the disc has remained untouched. Each day, a single Swiss guard was stationed outside that room, though no one explained why. One custodian once reported hearing a low hum coming from behind the case. He was transferred the following week. What makes the disc so mysterious is not what it does, but what it does not allow. No sound in its vicinity is clearly recorded. No light is cleanly reflected. No explanation remains coherent. It simply listens tonight as you lie in the quiet and darkness. Imagine a stone that remembers something long buried, something still waiting beneath the Vatican, whose secrets are not kept in words, but in silence measured by sound, a secret that listens more than it shows and answers to no one. Beneath the layers of stone and the silence of the Vatican Hill lies a forgotten folder, kept in the private architectural archive. The paper inside is yellowed, but not ancient. The cover reads a single name, Ecclesia Subta, the church below. It is not a myth, it is a project. A complete blueprint for a cathedral that, by all accounts, was never built. The designs are detailed, arches, pews, altars, and a towering dome that almost mirrors that of St. Peter's Basilica. Yet this church was not meant to rise towards the Roman sky, it was to be constructed beneath. The dimensions match exactly the depths of the necropolis below, and yet it is precisely here that the enigma thickens. There is no evidence this plan was ever authorized, funded, or even debated, except for a few names now inked out. One of the scholars who discovered the plans during cataloguing work in 1991 sensed something anomalous. The components indicated in the margins were not common for the era the drawings were made. One depicted a type of rock no longer quarried, another consisted of red volcanic glass, noted as sacred and to be kept from direct sunlight. This detail alone was unusual. And even more unsettling was the seal imprinted on the corner of the last page, bearing the symbol of a long-vanished Vatican body, the Congregation for the Keepers of the Veil, a denomination absent from modern ecclesiastical archives and which until then had only surfaced in whispered accounts among older priests. It was said to be a clandestine order whose task was not to spread the divine word, but to conceal what must remain hidden. When the scholar questioned his superior about the discovery, he was ordered to speak no more of the matter. Weeks later, the plans vanished. The file was gone, however. The scholar had made a single sketch in his journal. In the centre of the underground cathedral's floor was no cross. A circle stood surrounded by 7 points, each marked with what he believed were angelic seals. Instead of pews, the design showed only empty areas, as if it had been conceived for movement, not worship. A custodian working nearby recounted observing fragments of carved columns being moved into the Vatican storage tunnels around the same period. He remembered one distinctly because it bore no Latin inscription, but symbols he said looked like stars falling backward. He did not see them again. Was the underground church ever founded, built, and then sealed away, intentionally forgotten? Or was it not intended as a structure of worship, but of segregation? The Vatican will not give answers. No one should even know of its existence. Yet if you listen carefully, the atmosphere beneath the hill is still said to shift strangely in the old passages, as if flowing around something large, something circular, something long buried and still waiting. Beneath one of the deepest levels of the Vatican Hill, past the point where official paths end and the rock feels colder than normal, there exists a doorway no longer marked on any map. Behind that door lies a chamber sealed in the early 18th century, its purpose unknown, its contents predominantly empty, except for one wall. The wall is smooth and silent. It's made of pale marble, polished as if it's still waiting for someone's presence. But it's not the rock that bothers those who've seen it. It's the words carved in gold, not paint, not ink. The gold hasn't tarnished. It gleams faintly in the dim light, lighting up with even the slightest flicker of a candle. And it only says this: under this weight, heaven no longer watches. A sentence carved with perfect precision. No signature, no explanation. But whoever rid it leaves in silence, as if something ancient and heavy has watched them through the words. One of the few who spoke about it was a language scholar mistakenly called in when the inscription was first found in the 1950s. He expected a Latin text. What he found, he said, was neither completely Latin nor completely Greek, but something in between, something older. He said the gold wasn't just decoration. It had been poured into grooves carved by a hand that knew terror, not the terror of man, but of something else. Afterward, the scholar was moved to another position, far from Rome, and never returned to the Vatican. Oddly, the chamber itself shows signs of use. There are scuff marks on the floor, as if furniture or heavy objects had been dragged out. In one corner of the room there's a patch of burned rock, blackened as if by fire. But there's no soot, no clue what caused it. The ceiling has no air vents. The air is still, thick like a held breath. And yet, it's the golden message that visitors remember most. A former Jesuit, allowed in only once, claimed it seemed more like a confession than a warning, as if someone had sealed something under the Vatican, so terrible, so unholy, that even heaven decided to look away. There's no official record of who ordered the inscription or what was in the room before it was emptied, but on the inside of the door, lightly carved by a trembling hand, was a smaller message, not meant to be read. It said, "It is bound, but not broken." Even in a city of secrets, where forbidden texts rest in locked crypts, and fallen angels are whispered in bedtime stories, this silent golden wall stands as something different, not a myth, not a prayer, but a truth, etched in gold and in silence. In the spring of 1992, a man named Pietro Rinaldi arrived in Rome with quiet intentions. He was 63 years old. He was a retired professor from a small town near Florence, a kind man with tired eyes and a notebook always in his coat pocket. He had dreamed for years of making a pilgrimage to the Vatican, not just to admire the churches, but to feel closer to something sacred. He joined a small group that visited the Vatican museums and went deep into the heart of the ancient city. They moved slowly through long halls and silent chapels, with the guide explaining everything in a soft, expert voice. But Pietro, curious and often distracted, fell behind. He wasn't drawn to the guide's words, but to what was just beyond the barriers, just behind the closed doors, towards the end of the tour. Not far from the path leading to the lower rooms of the Apostolic Palace, Pietro strayed, or perhaps he didn't stray, but simply went unnoticed. No one saw him leave. No one heard him step off the marble path and take a narrow, little-used corridor. The guards noticed his absence less than 10 minutes later. They searched in silence. The instructions were clear. Don't cause panic, don't alarm visitors, and don't alert the higher offices unless absolutely necessary. But as minutes turned into an hour, their silence grew thick. Pietro was found lying on the cold floor behind a locked iron gate deep in the lower floors of the museum. His notebook was still in his pocket, but the pages had been torn out. His eyes were open, he was breathing, but he said nothing. Not then, not later, never again. Doctors examined him. There was no sign of injury, no illness. He simply didn't speak, didn't respond. He blinked. He breathed. But something inside him had stopped, like a candle extinguished without wind. The Vatican said little. A sober one-paragraph statement mentioned a mild medical event and thanked the doctors for their care. But a guard, who left his post shortly after the incident, told a different story years later. He said the gate Pietro had passed should never have been open, that it had been sealed for decades, that no key fit the lock, and yet it was ajar. Inside that space was a corridor too short to lead anywhere and too dark to see clearly, and at the end, faintly carved into the wall, was a symbol no one could identify. A circle, broken by 3 lines and the outline of a downward-pointing wing. Since that day, that corridor has been sealed again, welded shut, with no official comment, no record. And Pietro Rinaldi, the pilgrim who walked too far, now lives in a quiet nursing home near Lake Como. He sits at the window every morning, always looking east, and whispers something no one understands, a word that sounds like a name no one dares to write. In the winter of 1974, The Vatican was unusually quiet. A light rain had fallen on Rome, and the grand stone halls echoed with the silence of wet footsteps. Inside the Pontifical Gregorian University, hidden in a side room of the theological archives, a young seminarian named Marco Folletti worked through the night. Marco had been tasked with reorganizing old scrolls, many of which hadn't been touched in decades. He was a quiet, studious man, deeply respectful of the rules. But that night, as the wind howled outside and candles flickered, he noticed something strange. A scroll wasn't in the inventory. The leather case was darker than the others, worn with time, and sealed with a cord that didn't meet Vatican standards. When Marco opened it, he expected another theological letter or a forgotten decree. But what he unrolled was something completely different. The writing wasn't Latin. It wasn't Greek. It flowed in curved, winding shapes, like the movement of a wing over water. At first he thought it was decorative, but as he slowly turned the scroll in the candlelight, he noticed something else. There were drawings, faint and delicate. One showed a staircase under a broken dome, another a pit dug into the stone, surrounded by figures hunched in prayer or in fear. At the bottom of the page, drawn in shimmering ink, was a wing. It didn't soar like those of angels. It fell, heavy and curved downwards, as if burdened by more than simple gravity. Marco's hands trembled. There was something alive in the scroll. He took it to Father Benedetto, his mentor. A man who had served the Vatican for more than 30 years, Benedetto closed his eyes upon seeing it. He didn't speak. He just lit another candle and slowly, carefully turned the pages to the very last line. He whispered the words aloud. Wings made of silence. Then he closed the scroll and put it back in its case. "You didn't find this," Benedetto said. Marco nodded, though his thoughts were loud. The next day, the scroll was gone. The room had been emptied, its contents moved. No explanation, no discussion. Benedetto would never speak of it again, and Marco, once so full of faith and curiosity, withdrew. Within weeks, he left the seminary. No one knew where he had gone, but years later someone sent a single page to the Gregorian University. No return address. No name showed a copy of the final drawing from the scroll, that of the pit within the stone, and below it the words Marco remembered too well, wings made of silence. To this day there is no trace of that scroll in the Vatican archives. Some believe it's a forgery, others consider it a warning. But there are those who claim the scroll reappears once every few decades, never in the same place. All was at midnight, and all was to someone who is ready to leave something behind. There is a room in the Apostolic Palace that few see. Inside, lit by a single low lamp and cooled by stone walls, a small black box is kept. It's not marked with a name or date, it doesn't appear in the official Vatican archives, but it's guarded night and day, always by two men whose orders come from someone no one knows. Inside that box lies the black key. The key itself is strange. It's made of a metal no one can define. It doesn't reflect light like gold or silver. In fact, under the lamp it seems to absorb it. It's smooth and cold, even when held in a warm hand. It makes no sound when struck, and yet some say they hear a faint hum when they close their eyes and touch it. The key doesn't open anything, at least nothing known. Many have tried. Over the years, Vatican locksmiths, engineers, and even quiet scholars from the secret archive have examined it. They have all given the same answer. The key doesn't open any door, any lock, any box or passage, but none of them dare to throw it away. And the strange thing is that it's never found where it was left. Even under surveillance, even locked in its box, the key moves. One night it's tilted, the next morning it's straight, sometimes it's warm, sometimes freezing, and once, in the winter of 1964, it had completely disappeared. For 2 days the box remained empty. No alarm was triggered, no guard reported any movement. Then, on the third night, the key returned, placed in the box, upright, slightly tilted towards the door. One of the guards assigned that night left his post and refused to return. His written statement was brief. "He knows I looked at him." Years later, among the private papers of Cardinal Stefano Norietti, known for his work in the Vatican Library, a letter was discovered. In it, Norietti described a key forged not by man but by silence itself, and a warning passed down through 3 generations of guardians. The key, he wrote, was not meant to open something, it was meant to keep something sealed. No one will say aloud what that something is, but in the secret halls of the Vatican, where mystery meets history, where secrets float behind the stone, the black key remains untouched. And according to an ancient phrase carved inside the box, in Latin barely visible in the light, whoever turns this turns the eye of the fallen. And no one knows what that really means, but no one has tried to turn it, at least not yet. Perhaps it's not what the key opens that we should fear, but what hears the sound. Beneath the floors of the Vatican Library hides a crypt. It's known to the public only in hushed tones, hidden behind marble and time. Its door is thick and ancient, sealed with a symbol few recognize. But this is not what we will talk about tonight. There's another crypt, not beneath the library, but beyond. Beyond a corridor that curves where no corridor should. Its location doesn't appear on any map, not even those kept in the Vatican archives. Only 2 men know how to find it. This rule hasn't changed in over 400 years. One of the 2 is always a cardinal, the other is always the librarian. Neither of them speaks of the crypt, neither to each other, nor to anyone else. If one of them dies, their replacement is chosen in secret, without ceremony, without written documents. It's said that inside the second crypt there is a single wooden table, and on it a document so old that the parchment looks more like ash than paper. The title is short, written in faded ink and in a long-forgotten language, but translated it says, Ezekiel's Burden. That name alone has puzzled scholars. The prophet Ezekiel had visions of wheels in the sky, creatures with many wings and talking fire, but no scripture speaks of a burden he left behind, and yet there it rests. The first to describe it was Father Michael Loret, a Jesuit historian who claimed to have served as assistant to the pontifical librarian in 1957 in a never-published letter. He wrote, "There is a crypt no one speaks of. Its breath is still, its air is ancient, and when I looked at the document, something inside me knew I had seen it before in a dream or another life. It speaks without words. It warns without sound." After writing these words, Father Michel disappeared, left his order and vanished into the countryside. His last known address was a monastery that burned down in 1961. No bodies were found inside. Afterward, a new librarian was quietly appointed. What is hidden in Ezekiel's Burden remains unknown. Some believe it's a map, others a list. Someone has suggested that it's not what's written on the paper that matters, but what lies beneath. Some say it hums. Others say it moves when no one is looking. There's one last rumour, a rumour so strange that even archivists pretend not to have heard it, that the second crypt is not built to keep men out, but to keep something in. Something that once spoke to a prophet through fire and smoke. Something the church cannot destroy, only guard, and the deeper you go, the more it waits. In early spring of 1978, the Vatican archives were colder than usual. Outside, Rome was warming up, but deep within the Apostolic Palace the air was still, light bulbs hummed, dust floated slowly from forgotten shelves. And that morning, a door that rarely opened creaked open. The sentinels stepped aside. No proclamations, no rituals. Pope John Paul I crossed the threshold alone. His presence in the archives had not been expected. There was no trace in the official documents. Yet those who worked there still remember it clearly. His steps were measured, not like someone searching for something, but like someone who already knows their destination. It said he didn't carry any books or scrolls, just a letter, folded in 3 and sealed with crimson wax. When offered help, he smiled, shook his head and went to the north wing, where the restricted texts are kept. No one could go with him, but one helper named Luca Ferretti waited at the entrance. He stood still for about 60 minutes. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, uneven. The Pope reappeared, his eyes red and face pale. He didn't say a word, walked past Luca, went past the guards, and walked down the hallway in complete silence. But just before he disappeared around the corner, he mumbled something, very softly, as if only to himself. They knew it from the beginning. The next day, his schedule went back to normal. No mention of the visit, but Luca felt something had changed. The Holy Father moved with a new seriousness, as if he had seen something too big to be held by thought alone. 23 days later, Pope John Paul I had passed away. Heart failure, according to the papers. Peaceful, sudden, natural. In the weeks that followed, however, a whisper started spreading among the few who worked in the deep archives. Someone had entered the restricted storage the day after the papal visit. Someone with no identity or religious clothes, just gloves, a dark briefcase, and a voice no one could quite remember later. When asked what the Pope had looked at, the staff couldn't answer. The letter was gone, as was the page in the archive records where his name should have been. Only Luca's memory remained. He later wrote down what he believed the Pope had whispered to him, not as a warning, but as a plea. It lies beneath our faith, and we are the illusion. That line doesn't appear in any gospel, but Luca claimed it was written on the back of the letter the Pope had carried, drawn in ink so dark it glowed blue under the archive lamps. No further explanation followed, but those who knew him believed the Pope wasn't crying out of fear, but because he knew a truth too big to be shared, and perhaps, just perhaps, too old to be changed. Names have power, in scriptures, in magic, and especially in the hidden corners of Vatican history. A name, once spoken, can bind or free, reveal or hide. And somewhere beneath the rooms of Rome, locked away by rock and time, it's said that the Vatican guards a name that hasn't been spoken aloud in over 1,000 years. It's the name of an angel, but not the kind you imagine in paintings or hymns. This one doesn't carry a trumpet or a smile from the clouds. This one fell, and unlike the story of Lucifer, cast down for pride, this one fell by choice, but didn't forget paradise. The Vatican calls it a contradiction, a winged mystery, and its name isn't written in any public text, not in the Book of Enoch, not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not even whispered in the long dark halls of the Vatican Library. But some say it's hidden. There's an old book kept in a locked drawer, marked only with the letter V. It's not bound in leather, but in an unknown skin. The ink glows faintly when the lights are dim, and on the first page there's no title, just a sequence of letters rearranged like a puzzle. No one had figured it out for centuries, until a young seminarian named Tommaso did. It was the winter of 1983, during his last weeks before taking his vows. He had been assigned to help in the archive, where he catalogued quiet documents no one else wanted to handle. One night, out of boredom, he started looking at the sequence of symbols in the book. He noticed they followed a rhythm, almost like a song, 3 notes, then 5, then a pause, and as he adjusted the lamp over his head, the ink glowed, not red, not black, but something like silver hidden beneath the surface. When he spoke that form aloud, softly, like a whisper, he said he felt as if the room itself squeezed tighter around him. The walls held their breath. The air stood still. He never spoke that name again. 3 days later, he asked to leave the seminary. No explanation. No protest, he quietly disappeared into a monastery, where he refused to speak to anyone for the next 30 years. But before he left, he told the story to one person, an old priest, who then wrote the account in a private diary, now sealed in the Vatican's inner crypt. He wrote that the name didn't start with a sound, but with a silence, that it didn't mean light bringer or morning star like Lucifer, but something older, he freely translated it this way: the one who watches from the centre, not above, not below, but in the middle, and that's why it must remain trapped under Rome, because if its name were ever spoken again, it might answer. On the edge of Vatican City, not far from the grand dome of St. Peter's Basilica, there's a small bell tower few tourists notice. It's not grand, it doesn't shine, but it holds 4 bells, each older than the last. Most days they stay still, the metal blackened by time. But when they ring, something strange happens. The bells are not part of public worship. They are not used for weddings, funerals, or celebrations. Their sound is deep and heavy, like a breath drawn from the depths of the earth. Records show they have only rung 13 times in the last 200 years. Each time, a member of the College of Cardinals died within the next 24 hours. The Vatican never speaks publicly about the bells, but in the quiet halls of the archives, monks speak of them in hushed tones with uneasy glances. They call them the stone voice, and legend says they were made from iron taken from the hill of Golgotha. According to a manuscript, the bells were put in place during the reign of Pope Innocent VIII, around the year 1484. At that time, a strange illness was said to be spreading among the Roman clergy. Some believed it was poison, others claimed it was a punishment. The bells, they said, were not meant to announce death, but to warn of something that had been disturbed. But what had been disturbed remained a secret. In 1963, during the Second Vatican Council, the bells rang in the early hours before dawn. There had been no storm, no visitors, no earthquake. But the bells rang once, then again, a third time, and a fourth. That day, Cardinal Vincenzo Marchesi collapsed at his desk. His last words were not in Latin, but in Aramaic, a language he had never studied. A single sentence: "Open it and it will see you." No one has ever clarified what he meant. After that incident, the bells were locked and sealed with Vatican wax. It is said that only 3 people have the keys: the Pope, the head of the Swiss Guard, and the prefect of the secret archive. They meet once every 10 years to inspect the tower and make sure the bells haven't been tampered with. But in 2021, a security camera recorded something impossible. Between midnight and 3 in the morning, the bell tower showed a tiny movement. Not a person, not a shadow, just a slender shape, like heat rising from stone. That night the bells never rang, but the sound of 4 chimes was heard by a night guard on the other side of the city walls. When asked what he had heard, he replied softly, "It wasn't the sound of metal," he said. "It was like something calling to the metal, waiting to be struck again. And now the bells remain silent until they are not." Beneath the shiny marble floors of Vatican City is a room visitors never see. It's small, windowless, and colder than the rest of the old buildings. The air smells of copper, the walls are bare stone, and in the centre of the floor is a mosaic. At first glance, it looks like an early Roman church artwork. Red and gold tiles form patterns of vines and angels, similar to those found in the catacombs beneath St. Peter's Basilica. But looking closer, the angels in this mosaic are different. Their wings are not spread in flight, but folded down. Their eyes are closed, and around each one is a chain. Not a painted chain, a real one. It's said the chains are made of iron, older than the Roman Empire, and melted into the floor to hold something down below. No one knows who put them there, or how they were forged, but, hidden in Vatican records, there's a mention of an altar built over the chains, not under them. This mosaic is not a floor, it's a lid. In 1928, a Jesuit archivist named Father Lionel Pera was tasked with cleaning and documenting the space. At the time, it was considered a forgotten room from the Middle Ages, but as he removed layers of soot and candle ash, he discovered a small inscription, written in Greek. It read, "Not bound by man, nor unbound by God." Father Lionel wrote it in his diary. That same night, he was found outside the Apostolic Palace, unconscious and barefoot, mumbling phrases in a language Vatican linguists couldn't identify. He never returned to the archives. Some believe he touched the chains, but here's the part Vatican officials never talk about. In the year 2000, during repair work on the nearby hallway, a team of engineers tried to install new supports in the surrounding stone. When their drills reached the foundations beneath the mosaic, they all broke, not fractured, not worn down. They shattered, as if they had hit something that refused to be touched. Later, a guard reported hearing a sound that night. It came from the room. Not a voice, not a bell, but something slow and metallic, like a chain being dragged in a circle. The mosaic has remained untouched to this day. It's not on official Vatican maps. Tour guides never talk about it, priests walk past without looking, and only one archive mentions it by name. Custodia Lux, the chain of light. But if it's meant to contain light, what exactly is kept in the darkness below? The letter was not meant to be read. It was sealed in thick wax, marked only by the faint cross of the Society of Jesus, and buried under layers of forgotten documents in the Vatican's restricted archives. For over 150 years it remained there, untouched, its paper darkening with time, its words trapped in silence. It was written in the year 1870 by a Jesuit priest named Matteo de Luca. His name had practically disappeared from church records. No obituary, no farewell, no proper burial. It was as if he had vanished from the world in a single breath, but his letter remained. It was discovered only in 1982 during a secret inventory. A young archivist named Paolo Moretti opened the file. Expecting only travel documents, what he found was something completely different. The letter began with shaky handwriting. To whom it may concern, if this letter has survived, then I have not. Father Matteo's words were direct, but filled with something strange, not fear, not madness, something more, a kind of reverence. He wrote about a room beneath the Apostolic Palace, a room he had entered only once, on orders he didn't understand. He described walls made not of stone, but of something smooth, cold, and black like glass. And in the centre of the room, he wrote, there was no statue, no altar, no light, only a presence. He never gave it a name. Instead, he wrote, there is something beneath Rome that watches us, but does not see with eyes. It listens, but only to silence. It has been kept asleep, not by prayer, but by agreement. He went on to confess that, after entering the chamber, he had dreams that were not his own, visions of ruined cities, voices speaking backwards. He said the dreams would stop for days, only to return stronger, more intense, as if something was slowly waking up, feeling the air above it. The last line of the letter read, they said it was an angel, but if it was, it has fallen lower than we can understand. Father Matteo signed the letter and dated it, July 3rd, 1870. No one ever knew what happened to him next. His room, in the Jesuit quarters, was emptied, his belongings packed and sent to a warehouse, but the room he spoke of and what it contained remain unknown. When the archivist Paolo handed over the letter, it was quietly removed from the archives and never recorded, but he copied it by hand, just once, for himself. And 2 years later, Paolo left the Vatican service for good, moved to a small town outside Florence, and never spoke of Rome again, not even to his wife. The sky over St. Peter's Basilica was an unsettling grey. That February night in 2013, Rome held its breath, not for the weather, but for the words just spoken. For the first time in almost 600 years, a pope had resigned. Pope Benedict XVI, in a low, tired voice, announced his resignation. The reasons given were old age, frailty, the desire to pray away from the burden of the throne. But then, less than 2 hours later, lightning struck the dome of St. Peter's. It wasn't just one bolt. There were two, caught on film by a photographer who happened to be watching the sky. The moment was shared around the world, but inside the Vatican it wasn't shared. It was whispered, because it had already happened once, long ago, and the documents from that day were hidden in an archive not many had access to. One of the men who had access to that data was Father Leone, a senior archivist who had worked in the Vatican Library since the early 70s. He had studied the patterns not just in documents but in events, and he recognized the lightning. He remembered a page from a Jesuit weather diary from the year 1799, which recorded a lightning bolt that had struck the dome on the day Pope Pius VI was taken prisoner by French forces. The dome wasn't damaged, but the archives said something had shifted that day beneath the marble floor. Father Leone once described what he called deep vibrations, felt through his shoes in the archives the night Benedict resigned. Not like thunder, he said, more like something breathing under the stone. When he told them, they said it was nothing, just nerves, old age, but Father Leone had kept his own notes, and in one of those private journals, he wrote that the lightning was a sign of a rejection of release. He believed the fallen angel, still held beneath the city, reacted to changes in power, that it didn't fear men, but watched the popes. And when someone tried to step away from Rome's highest seat without fulfilling a vow made in secret, the earth itself responded. A few weeks later, the new pope was elected, taking the name Francis, and while most celebrated the smooth transition, some within the walls remained uneasy because the lightning didn't strike again, and Father Leone's last note, scribbled in the margin next to his handwriting, simply read, "The dome is listening." No one ever asked him what it meant, and he never offered to explain. There's a tomb beneath the Vatican that no one talks about. No plaque, no document, no name. Just a smooth slab of ancient stone hidden behind a wall that was never meant to be opened. In 1959, during routine maintenance work beneath the Vatican gardens, 2 workers heard a sound similar to a stone moving. One of them, a man named Carlo Bernini, leaned against the old bricks lining the tunnel when a small section gave way. What he discovered wasn't a tunnel, but a sealed room, and in the centre of it, surrounded by silence and dust, was an unmarked tomb. Bernini reported it to his supervisor, who in turn reported it to a Monsignor. The next day, the wall was rebuilt, Bernini was transferred elsewhere, and that tunnel was never explored again, at least so they said. Many years later, it was 1974, a visiting scholar from the University of Salamanca, Professor Elena Ruiz, received an invitation to study some of the ancient burial maps kept in the Vatican. What she discovered deeply disturbed her. A pattern of 4th century burials showed a tomb marked as ex ignibus, a Latin phrase meaning born of fire, but what truly troubled her was where it was located. It was situated much deeper than the known layers of tombs and catacombs. She asked for permission to visit it. It was denied. When she insisted again, the Vatican archivist she was working with, an elderly clergyman named Father Matteo, asked her, "Why would you want to seek something that has neither name nor blessing?" She didn't immediately understand the meaning of those words, but later that night, as she walked alone among the library shelves, she saw Father Matteo conversing with an individual dressed in a simple dark robe. He held something in his hands, a photograph of the nameless tomb, and it was burning. The corners of the photograph curled in on themselves, yet no flames touched them. She quickly walked away. The next morning, Dr. Ruiz was informed that her time in the archive was over. In the following years, soft whispers have travelled through the Vatican halls. Voices about a chamber built not to house a body, but to serve as a prison, and the stone lid of the tomb, smooth and cold, had 7 round markings, as if something had once been sealed there and then carefully removed. There are those who maintain that the nameless tomb holds the remains of a being that never knew breath, a figure erased not by the passage of time, but by precise will, something not buried for honour, but locked away, guarded for generations. And if you ask those who have worked near the old service tunnels what they hear during silent nights, they say nothing, but they often look at the ground as if listening for footsteps coming from beneath the stone. Countless rituals are held in the Vatican. Some are of rare beauty, filled with choirs and torches. Others are archaic, whispered only in the dusty corners of the archives, never meant to be made public. But there is one, so ancient and dangerous, that even its name has been erased from all official records. The priests who know it simply call it the rite that must not be spoken of. In early 1932, a young archivist named Lucien Moretti obtained authorization to examine a decaying manuscript recovered from a protected chamber in the Vatican necropolis. It had no title, but it smelled of burning. The ink was faded in many sections. Some pages were too delicate to touch, but Lucien was fascinated by a part marked by a single crimson thread woven into the binding. On the page were only 10 lines, each one an instruction, and although the words were in Latin, the atmosphere around Lucien grew denser as he read them aloud, in a low voice, as if he sensed they were not meant for a mortal voice. That night, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang once at 3 a.m. No one had pulled the rope. Lucien returned the next day and discovered the manuscript had disappeared. In its place, he found a message written in dark red ink, which said only, "Do not read, do not speak." He never found that manuscript again, but the nightmares began immediately. He told a colleague that he saw a dark, long, windowless passage lined with tall metal doors. Behind one of them something was breathing, not like a human being would, but like the wind inside a cavern, burning, ancient and furious, and each time, an instant before waking, Lucien saw the crimson thread, which led not to a book, but to a rough stone altar. In 1951, more than 10 years after Lucien was transferred to a small Sicilian chapel, the Vatican archives quietly classified a dossier with extreme restrictions, ritus obscurus, meaning the dark rite. It was never opened. It is speculated discreetly and cautiously that this rite was performed only once. Some argue that it served not to free anything but to bind something, to imprison it so deeply that it could not be summoned by name. Even the highest-ranking cardinals speak of it only behind closed doors, and only if the windows are covered. The rite that must not be spoken of is not a legend, and it is not a warning. It is a memory, buried in the rock, guarded by silence and hidden beneath the holiest city in the world. But if you ever heard the bells ring at 3, and no one could explain why, they would say it's not a mistake, it's a sign. And the words, though forbidden since time immemorial, still echo in the dust. There is a place in the Vatican known only to very few, a small chamber hidden next to the majestic Sistine Chapel. It is silent, dimly lit, and draped in crimson cloth, and it contains no treasures, no golden crosses, no relics of power. It is called the Room of Tears. Every new pontiff must enter it alone after his election. He sits there, not yet as sovereign, but as a man, simply a man, facing what awaits him. The name is fitting. Many weep, some pray, others sit in silence, as if waiting for something more ancient than words. In 1978, the newly elected Pope John Paul III entered the Room of Tears. He was a humble man, known for his benevolent smile and gentle spirit. He had no enemies, no scandals, no thirst for power. But when he left the room, his smile was gone. He seemed changed, not simply aged, but deeply moved. He returned to the chapel almost without speaking. That night he wrote a letter to his private secretary questioning him about a voice he believed he had heard in the room. A whisper, sweet and icy like a breath on glass, had spoken his name. He died 33 days later. In the Room of Tears there are no microphones, no cameras. It is considered a consecrated space, untouched by the outside world. But after his death, the Vatican discreetly replaced the old wooden chair he'd sat in. No one ever explained why. Years passed and the story faded. But then, in the winter of 1997, a young cleaning employee working late at night was asked to polish the silver crucifix in that very room. He was alone, or so he thought, as he dusted the wall behind the red cloths. He claimed to have heard that whisper too, only this time it didn't speak a name. It said, "Still waiting?" The employee left the Vatican the next day and never returned. Some months later, a historian named Matteo Grandi gained limited access to the Room of Tears for a special project related to the anniversary. He noticed something unusual. The painting behind the altar had been retouched in a tiny spot, just enough to hide something the size of a handprint. When he looked closer, he saw fine lines under the new paint, winding lines, not letters, not symbols, more like veins. What he discovered was never published. The Vatican has denied any modifications to the room, and yet occasionally cardinals and guards have felt a strange cold in the room. A cold that doesn't match the weather, a cold that appears and disappears like a breath, a presence. It is said that the Room of Tears holds much more than sorrow. It remembers. And when the whisper returns, it will no longer ask anything. It will answer. Long before the Vatican rose on the hills of Rome, beneath it was the rock shaped not by mortal hands, but by something more ancient. Beneath the cobblestone streets and consecrated chapels, far below the silence of St. Peter's Basilica, there is a room that few believe is real. They call it the waiting cell. No official map shows it. No hallway leads to it. And yet, in 1962, a Vatican archivist named Father Emiliano Rossi was led there by mistake. At least that's what he claimed. He should have been cataloguing 13th century manuscripts, dusty scrolls, nothing more. But as he explored a sealed section beneath the Vatican Library, he followed what he thought was a draught of cool air, which led him down a narrow staircase that coiled like a snake and ended in a small stone chamber. No light, no sound, just a faint glow. He swore it didn't come from the lamps he carried with him, and in that silence he said he saw it. A kneeling figure, wings carefully folded, not broken, not free. He never called it an angel, not at first. He said it looked like a statue carved from ash and bones, but when he turned to leave, he heard it breathe, just once. Years later, when Father Emiliano disappeared during the spring rains of 1983, all they found in his quarters was a single torn page. It contained a single sentence, written in Latin: "The angel still waits." That was the last thing he wrote. The Vatican has made no statements about his disappearance. But 2 weeks later, a section of the Vatican Library was closed for maintenance, permanently. Some say it was a coincidence, others believe the chamber was sealed again. In 2006, a security guard working nights on the lower floors of the museum heard a slight tapping beneath his feet, rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was marking time from below. He followed it as far as he could. He went down 3 floors. He passed 2 locked doors, until he reached a wall hot to the touch, but on the other side, there was only silence. When questioned about the report, Vatican officials stated that no similar noise had ever been recorded, but a week later, the guard was reassigned. The whispers continue, as always. The monks speak in low voices of the deepest cell in the Vatican, a place not of punishment, but of protection, not for humanity, but from it. If what lies beneath the Vatican is truly an angel, then it is not the kind of angel seen in paintings. It is a creature endowed with judgment, a being not only cast down from heaven, but buried by the Church itself, and it still waits, not for forgiveness, but for authorization, because some doors were never locked to prevent others from entering. They were sealed to contain a single thing. Beneath the streets of Rome, beyond the pillars of power and prayer, silence hangs like incense in the darkness. It has hung for centuries, shrouded in the stone beneath the Vatican, where not even time dares to speak too loudly. In that silence, the story ends where it began, with an invisible presence, but never entirely forgotten. The legend of the angel, the being said to be imprisoned, has never been confirmed. No pope has spoken its name, no priest has admitted to seeing it. And yet, in the oldest corners of the Vatican, the doors remain unlocked, guarded by men who never look away. No explanation is ever given, only silent orders passed down from one generation of guards to another. The deeper you go, the less you find, and somehow the more you perceive. There is a place known only in whispers. Even the cleaning staff are told to avoid it. The air turns icy near the entrance. Crosses are inverted on the walls, not as decoration, but as a warning. Those who have worked in the archives claim to have felt watched, even though there was no living soul. In the 60s, a young seminarian disappeared for 3 days in the basement corridors. When he was found, he could no longer speak. He never served again. His name was erased from the archives, his room emptied, as if he had never existed. But his shoes remained under the bed. The Vatican gave no explanations, it never does, but the stories continue to echo in the marble halls, and in the minds of those who cannot sleep. There is always a last door, always a light that flickers when it shouldn't. People wonder why the archives are so big, why so many are underground, away from the sunlight. The answer, it seems, might not be to protect the world's secrets, but to protect the world from what lies with the secrets. For years, a single chamber has remained sealed with 7 locks. Each lock is different, forged by a different hand. No one claims to have the keys, and yet someone, somewhere, must know what is behind that door. Or worse, someone once knew and now chooses not to remember. The story of the fallen, of the bound, has never been proven, and yet the guards have doubled, the doors have grown larger, the silence has grown thicker. No voice speaks from below, but the silence, in its own way, listens. And maybe, just maybe, what waits beneath the Vatican is not a prisoner, but a presence. I'm still waiting. Thanks for sticking with us until the end. If any of these Vatican mysteries have sparked something in you, a question, a shiver, or just a quiet wonder, leave us a comment below. We read them all, and if you found this story worth your time, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss a journey into the hidden corners of history. Be curious, think, and until next time, sleep well and dream deeper.